He had played this same game before, and had anticipated this time out it would be something of a letdown. It came as a pleasant surprise then to find that it gave him even more of a thrill. He had boarded the luxury cruise ship Gabrielle in Perth, Australia only yesterday, planning to sail as far as Kobe. But he had found her immediately, so the extra ports would not be necessary. She had been seated at a window table in the liner's paneled dining room, a discreetly elegant space typical of the Gabrielle. He was cautious by nature, although in truth there was little likelihood of his being recognized by previous shipmates. He had become a master at altering his appearance. As he studied Regina Clausen, he decided that she could use a makeover herself. She was one of those 40-ish women who could have been quite attractive if she only knew how to dress, how to present herself. Of course, he knew who she was. He had seen Clausen in action at a stockholders' meeting only a few months ago, and he had also watched her on CNBC in her capacity as a stock research analyst. Certainly in those venues she had come across as forceful and very sure of herself. That was why, when he had spotted her sitting wistfully and alone at a table, he knew right away how easy it was going to be. He raised his glass, and with the faintest movement in her direction, offered a silent toast. "Your prayers have been answered, Regina," he promised. "From now on, you belong to me." 3 years later. Barring a blizzard or something bordering on a hurricane, Dr. Susan Chandler walked the mile to work each day from her brownstone apartment in Greenwich Village to her office in the turn-of-the-century building in Soho. A clinical psychologist, she had a thriving private practice and at the same time had established something of a public persona as a host of a popular radio program, Ask Dr. Susan, that aired each weekday. The early morning air on this October day was crisp and breezy, and she was glad she had opted for a long-sleeved turtleneck sweater under her suit jacket. It was only 7:30, and the streets weren't crowded yet. In another hour, they would be teeming with Monday morning back-to-work New Yorkers. "Thank God the weekend's over," Susan said to herself fervently. She had spent most of Saturday and Sunday in Rye with her mother, who had been in low spirits. Understandably so, Susan thought, since Sunday would have been her 40th wedding anniversary. Then, not helping the general situation, Susan had had an unfortunate encounter with her older sister, Dee, who was visiting from California. Sunday afternoon, before coming back to the city, she had made a courtesy call to her father's palatial home in nearby Bedford Hills, where he and his second wife, Binky, were throwing a cocktail party. Susan was usually the first to arrive on her floor, but today her old friend and mentor, Neda Harding, was the early bird. Susan stopped at the open door leading to Neda's office and smiled. Neda was engrossed in the thick file that was spread out before her. One of the most respected defense attorneys in New York, her somewhat grandmotherly appearance offered little indication of the cleverness and aggressive energy she brought to her work. The two women had met and become friends 10 years ago at NYU, when Susan was a 22-year-old second-year law student and Neda was a guest lecturer. All her friends, Neda being the only exception, had been shocked when, after 2 years in the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, Susan quit her job as assistant DA to go back to school and earn her doctorate in psychology. Sensing Susan's presence in her doorway, Neda looked up. Her smile was brief but warm. "Well, look who's here. Good weekend, Susan, or should I ask?" Neda knew about both Binky's party and Susan's mother's anniversary. "It was predictable," Susan said wryly. Dee got to Mom's house on Saturday, and the two of them ended up sobbing their hearts out. I told Dee her depression was only making it harder for Mother to cope, and she blasted me. Said that if 2 years ago I had watched my husband swept to his death in an avalanche the way she had watched Jack die, I'd understand what she was going through. Then there was Dad and Binky's party, she continued. Incidentally, Dad now requests that I call him Charles, which says it all on that subject. And that was my weekend. Another one like that, and I'll be the one who needs counseling. Netta eyed her sympathetically. She was the only one of Susan's friends who knew the full story about Jack and Dee, and about Susan's parents and the messy divorce. "Sounds to me as though you deserve a survival plan," she said. "Maybe you'll come up with one for me. Just put it on my tab, good friend, along with all I owe you already for getting me the radio job. Now I better get going. I've got stuff to prepare before the show. And by the way, have I said thanks recently?" "You're being silly. You wouldn't have gotten the job unless you could handle it. You're darn good, you know. Who's your guest today?" "This week I'll be concentrating on why women should be safety conscious in social situations. Dr. Donald Richards, a psychiatrist specializing in criminology, has written a book called Vanishing Women. It deals with some of the disappearances he's been involved with. Many of the cases he solved, but a number of interesting ones are still open. He covers the background of each woman and the circumstances under which she vanished, and then he discusses the possible reasons why such an intelligent woman could have gotten involved with a killer, followed by the step-by-step process of finding out what happened to her." "Good subject." "I think so. I've decided to bring up the Regina Clausen disappearance. That one always intrigued me. Remember her?" "Yes, I do. She disappeared about 3 years ago after disembarking from a world cruise in Hong Kong. It got a lot of publicity." "Well, that was after I left the district attorney's office," Susan said. "But I was visiting a friend when Regina Clausen's mother, Jane, came in to talk to the DA to see if he could help. The poor woman had pictures of Regina and kept saying how much her daughter had looked forward to the trip." Netta's expression softened. "I knew Jane Clausen slightly. She and I graduated from Smith the same year. She lives on Beekman Place now. She was always very quiet, and I gather Regina was also very shy socially." Susan raised her eyebrows. "I wish I'd realized you knew Mrs. Clausen. You might have been able to arrange for me to speak with her. According to my notes, Regina's mother had no inkling that her daughter was involved with someone, but if I could get her to talk about it, maybe something that didn't seem important at that time might come out and provide some clues." Netta frowned in concentration. "Maybe it's not too late. Doug Layton is the Clausen's family lawyer. I've met him several times. I'll call him at 9 and see if he'll put us in touch with her." At 10 after 9, the intercom on Susan's desk buzzed. It was Janet, her secretary. "Douglas Layton, an attorney, is on the line? Brace yourself, Susan. He doesn't sound happy." As soon as she began to speak to the Clausen family lawyer, it became very clear that he was indeed not happy. "Dr. Chandler, we absolutely resent any exploitation of Mrs. Clausen's grief. Regina was her only child. It would be bad enough if her body had been found, but because it has not, Mrs. Clausen agonizes constantly. It's a kind of limbo, wondering under what circumstances her daughter may be living, if indeed she is alive. I would have thought a friend of Netta Harding would be above this kind of sensationalism, exploiting grief with pop psychology." Susan clammed her lips together for an instant to cut off the heated response she was tempted to make. "Mr. Layton, you've already given the reason the case should be discussed. Surely it is infinitely worse for Mrs. Clausen to be wondering every day of her life whether her daughter is alive and suffering somewhere than to have definite knowledge of what really happened to her. My program is heard in 5 states. It's a very long shot, I know, but maybe someone who is listening today was on that ship or was visiting Hong Kong at the same time and will call in and tell us something helpful, hopefully, about seeing Regina after she left the Gabrielle." Without waiting for a response, Susan hung up. "Now let's keep our fingers crossed that someone who knows something about the case is listening too," she thought. It was definitely a lucky stroke that his car radio had been tuned to the talk radio station on Friday. Otherwise, he'd never have heard the announcement. Not that there was anything to worry about, of course. He reassured himself of that. After all, Regina had been the easiest, the most eager to comply and fall in with his plans, the most anxious to agree that no hint of their shipboard romance be apparent to others. As always, he had taken every precaution. Clearly he'd been careful. Hadn't he? Next time he'd be especially careful. But then, the next one would be the last. There had been 4 so far, 1 more to go. He'd select her next week, and once she was his mission would be complete, and he would finally be at peace. Of course he had made no mistakes. It was his mission, and no one was going to stop him. Angrily, he listened to the warm, encouraging voice of Dr. Susan Chandler. Regina Clausen was a renowned investment advisor. Beyond that, she was a daughter, a friend, and an extremely generous benefactor of numerous charities. We'll be talking about her disappearance on my show today. We'd like to solve this mystery. Maybe one of you has a piece of the puzzle. He snapped off the radio. Dr. Susan, he said aloud, get off it and fast. All this is none of your business, and I warn you, if I have to make you my business, your days are numbered. Dr. Donald Richards, the author of Vanishing Women, and Susan's guest for the day, was tall and lean, and appeared to be in his late 30s. He spoke with calm and easy authority as they discussed several of the open cases he'd covered in his book, instances in which the victim had never been found. Then Susan brought up the Regina Clausen case. Regina Clausen was a highly respected investment advisor, she said. At the time of her disappearance, she was 43 years old. She lived alone and usually took vacations with her mother. 3 years ago, her mother was recovering from a broken ankle, so Regina Clausen went alone on a segment of the world cruise of the luxury liner Gabrielle. She embarked in Perth, planning to sail to Bali, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan, and disembarked in Honolulu. However, in Hong Kong, she got off the ship saying that she was going to spend extra time there and would rejoin the Gabrielle when it docked in Japan. That kind of alteration of itinerary is the sort of thing seasoned travelers regularly do, so her announced plan aroused no suspicions. Regina took only 1 suitcase and a carry-on with her when she disembarked, and she was reported to have been in good spirits and appeared very happy. She took a cab to the Peninsula Hotel, checked in, dropped her bags in her room, and left the hotel immediately. She was never seen again. Dr. Richards, if you were just starting to investigate this case, what would you do? I'd want to see the passenger list and find out if anyone else arranged to stay in Hong Kong. I'd want to know if she received phone calls or faxes on the ship. I'd want to question her fellow passengers to see if anyone noticed that she'd been getting particularly friendly with someone, most likely a man, also traveling alone. That's for openers. Well, all of that was done, Susan told him. A thorough investigation was undertaken. All that could be determined for certain was that Regina Clausen vanished the moment she left the hotel. I'd say she was meeting someone and went to great pains to keep it a secret, Richards said. In her headphones, Susan heard a signal from her engineer that calls were waiting. Now, why don't we go to the phones, she said. The calls were run-of-the-mill, except the last one. During the break, her producer, Jed Genie, spoke to Susan from the control room. There's one final call I want to put through. I warn you, though, that whoever is calling blocked off her ID from her end. She says she may know something about Regina Clausen's disappearance, so maybe it's worth paying attention to. She said to call her Karen. It's not her name. Put her on, Susan said. As the on-air light flashed, she spoke into the microphone. Karen is our last caller, and my producer tells me she may have something important to tell us. Hello, Karen. The caller spoke softly, almost too low to hear. Dr. Susan, I took a segment of the round-the-world trip 2 years ago. I was feeling pretty rotten because I was in the middle of a divorce. My husband's jealousy had become intolerable. There was a man on the trip. He made a big play for me, but he did it in a quiet, even discreet way. At the places we docked, he'd have me meet him at some designated spot away from the ship, and we'd explore that port together. Then later, we'd split up and return to the ship separately. He said the reason for such secrecy was that he hated exposing us to gossip. He was quite charming and very attentive, something I needed very badly at the time. Then he suggested that I leave the ship in Athens and spend more time with him there, and then we were going to fly to Algiers, and I could pick up the ship in Tangier. "Did you do what this man suggested?" Susan said. I was going to, but my husband phoned just then and begged me to give our marriage another chance. The man I was planning to meet had already disembarked. I tried to phone to say I was staying on the ship, but he wasn't registered at the hotel where he said he'd be staying, so I never saw him again. But I do have a photo with him in the background, and he gave me a ring that was inscribed, "You belong to me," which, of course, I never got a chance to return. Susan chose her words carefully. "Karen, what you're telling us may be very important in the investigation of Regina Clausen's disappearance. Will you meet me and show me that ring and photograph?" I can't get involved. My husband would be furious if he knew I'd even thought of changing my plans because I'd met someone." There's something she isn't telling us, Susan thought. Her name isn't Karen, and she's been trying to disguise her voice, and soon she's going to hang up. "Karen, please come to my office," Susan said quickly. "Here's the address." She rattled it off, then added, her voice pleading. "Regina Clausen's mother needs to find out what happened to her daughter. I promise I'll protect your privacy." "I'll be there at 3:00. The connection was broken. Carolyn Wells turned off the radio and walked nervously to the window. Across the street, the Metropolitan Museum of Art was blanketed in the quiet typical of Monday, its closing day. Since making that phone call to the Ask Dr. Susan radio show, she'd been unable to shake off a terrible sense of foreboding. If only we hadn't teased Pamela to do one of her readings for us, she thought, remembering the unsettling events of the previous Friday evening. She had cooked a 40th birthday dinner for her former roommate Pamela and had invited the other two women with whom they had shared an apartment on East 80th Street. They hadn't asked Pamela to do a reading for years. When they were younger and new to the city, they had almost made a ritual of somewhat jokingly asking her to assess their future with the new boyfriend or the new job offer. Later, though, her powers had been treated more seriously. Pamela herself no longer liked to acknowledge her gift of second sight, but it was called upon, however discreetly, by the police in cases of kidnappings and missing persons. After dinner, when they'd all been relaxing with a glass of port, Pamela had agreed to do a quick reading for each of them. As usual, she asked each woman to choose a personal object for her to hold while she did their individual readings. Why did I pick out that damn ring for her to hold? Carolyn thought. I never actually wore it, and it's certainly not valuable. I don't even know why I've kept it. When Pamela held the ring, she had noticed the almost illegible inscription inside the band and had examined it closely. "You belong to me?" she had read, her tone half amused, half horrified. "A little strong in this day and age, isn't it, Carolyn?" Pamela had closed her hand over the ring, and in an instant a perceptible change came over her. Her whole body became tense, and the expression on her face was suddenly grave. "Carolyn, this ring could have been the cause of your death. It may still be. Whoever gave it to you meant to harm you." Then, as though it were burning in her hand, she dropped the ring on the coffee table. It was at that moment that the key had turned in the door, and they had all jumped like guilty schoolgirls caught being naughty. By unspoken consent, they immediately changed the subject. They all knew that the separation was a taboo subject for Carolyn's husband, Justin, and they knew as well that he had no use for Pamela's readings. Carolyn remembered how she had quickly scooped up the ring and put it in her pocket. It was still there. Justin's excessive jealousy had been the cause of the breakup 2 years ago. Carolyn finally had had enough. The day he called her on the ship, he had promised to change. And God knows he tried, Carolyn thought. He's been in therapy, but if I get involved in this Dr. Susan thing, he'll think there really was something between Owen Adams and me, and we'll be back to square one. She had made a decision. She wouldn't keep the appointment with Susan Chandler. Instead, she would send her the shipboard picture taken at the captain's cocktail party, the picture that showed Owen Adams in the background. She'd crop it so that she wasn't in the picture, and she'd send it, along with the ring and Owen's name, to Chandler. I'll print a note on plain paper, she thought, so they'll never be able to trace it to me, and I'll keep it short and simple. If there was any tie between Owen Adams and Regina Clausen, it would be up to Chandler to find it. It would only look ridiculous for Carolyn to write that a psychic friend had claimed the ring was a symbol of death. Nobody would take that seriously. In her Beekman Place apartment, 74-year-old Jane Clausen turned off the radio, then sat for a long time staring through her window at the swiftly flowing current of the East River. She knew Regina was dead. In her heart it was a certainty. She had known it from the start, from the moment she received the call from the ship to say that Regina had not boarded as she had planned. Just now, listening to Dr. Chandler's program, she had been anguished when the author, Donald Richards, suggested that Regina might have been foolish enough to go off with some man she scarcely knew. I know my daughter, Jane Clausen thought. That wasn't her style. But then, how to explain the phone call, the one from Karen, who had phoned in to talk about a ring with "You Belong to Me" inscribed on the inside of the band. Jane Clausen had instantly recognized the phrase, and hearing the familiar words this morning had chilled her to the bone. When Regina did not return to the ship, her clothes and effects that had been left on board were packed and shipped home. At the request of the authorities, Jane had gone through them thoroughly to see if anything was missing. She had noticed the ring because it was so frivolous, so obviously inexpensive, a pretty little turquoise thing, the kind that tourists purchase on a whim. She had been sure that Regina either hadn't noticed the sentiment engraved inside the band or had ignored it. Turquoise was her birthstone. But if this woman who called herself Karen had been given a similar ring only 2 years ago, did it mean that the person responsible for Regina's death might still be preying on other women? Regina had disappeared in Hong Kong. Karen said she was supposed to get off her ship to go to Algiers. Jane Clausen stood, then walked slowly from the study to Regina's room. She went to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and removed the leather box in which Regina had kept her jewelry. The turquoise ring was in a velvet-lined compartment. She picked it up and slipped it on her finger. She went to the telephone and phoned Douglas Layton, the lawyer in the investment firm that handled the family's assets, who knew how desperately she had sought an answer to her daughter's disappearance. "Douglas, today at 2:45 you and I are going to be in Dr. Susan Chandler's office. I assume you listened to the program." "Yes, I did, Mrs. Clausen. I have got to talk to the woman who phoned in." "Well, I'd better call and tell Dr. Chandler we're coming." "That's exactly what I don't want you to do. I intend to be there and speak to that young woman myself." Jane Clausen replaced the receiver. Ever since she had heard how little time she had left, she had contented herself with the knowledge that this terrible sense of loss would soon be over. But now she felt a blazing new need. She had to make sure that no other mother experienced the pain she had felt these past 3 years. In the cab on the way back to her office, Susan Chandler thought about the phone call from the woman who called herself Karen. She had sounded so frightened when she phoned that Susan worried she might not show up at 3 as she had agreed. 5 minutes later, as Susan opened the door to her office, Her secretary, Janet, greeted her with an approving smile. "Good program, Doctor. We've gotten a lot of calls about it. I can't wait to see what this Karen is like." "Nor can I," Susan said. "Any important messages?" Yes. Your sister, Dee, phoned from the airport. She said she was sorry she missed you yesterday. She wanted to apologize for exploding at you Saturday. She also wanted to know what you thought of Alexander Wright. She met him at the party after you left. She says he's terribly attractive." Susan thought of the man who had overheard her father asking her to call him Charles. 40-ish, about 6 feet, sandy hair, an engaging smile, she remembered. He had come over to her when her father had turned away to greet a new arrival. "Don't let it get you down. It's probably Binky's idea," he had said encouragingly. Anxious to be away from the sight of her father gushing over Binky, and not anxious to run into her sister, Susan had left soon afterwards, though not before one of her friends whispered that Alex Wright was the son of the late Alexander Wright, the legendary philanthropist. Wright Library, Wright Museum of Art, Wright Center for the Performing Arts, big, big bucks. He is very attractive, Susan thought. At about 2:45, Janet informed her that Regina Clausen's mother and her attorney, Douglas Layton, were in the reception area. "Put them in the conference room," Susan directed. "I'll see them there." Jane Clausen looked very much the same as she had when Susan had glimpsed her in the office of the Westchester County District Attorney. Impeccably dressed in a black suit that must have cost the moon, gray hair perfectly coiffed, she had about her an air of reserve that suggested breeding. The lawyer, who had been so sharp on the telephone this morning, seemed almost apologetic. "Dr. Chandler, I hope we're not intruding. Mrs. Clausen has something important to show you, and she'd very much like having the opportunity to meet the woman who called in on your program this morning." Susan suppressed a smile as she detected a telltale tinge of red beneath his deep tan. Layton's dark blonde hair was sun-streaked, she noticed, and though he was soberly dressed in a dark business suit and tie, he still somehow managed to give the impression of an outdoor man. Jane Clausen opened her purse, reached inside, and pulled out a turquoise band. "My daughter had this ring in her stateroom in the Gabrielle. Please show it to Karen. If it's like the one she has, she simply must talk to me. Although please emphasize that I have no wish to know her true identity. Just every detail of the man she began to become involved with." She handed the ring to Susan. "Look at the inscription," Layton said. Susan peered at the tiny lettering, squinting, then gasped. "My secretary will bring you tea or coffee, Mrs. Clausen. Just pray that Karen shows up." "I'm afraid I can't stay," Layton said hurriedly. "Mrs. Clausen, I'm so sorry, but I was unable to cancel my appointment." "I do understand, Douglas." There was a slight but distinct edge to the woman's voice. "The car is waiting for me downstairs," she continued. "I'll be fine." His face brightened. "In that case, I'll take my leave." He nodded to Susan and was gone. Susan watched with increasing frustration as the hands of the clock crawled to 3:05, then 3:10. 3:15 became 3:30, then 4:15. At 4:00, Carolyn Wells was walking down 81st Street toward the post office, a manila envelope addressed to Susan Chandler under her arm. Irresolution and doubt had been replaced with a sense of an absolute need to get rid of the ring and the picture of the man who had called himself Owen Adams. Any temptation to keep the appointment with Susan Chandler, however, had disappeared when her husband phoned at 1:30. "Honey, the craziest thing," he had said, a joking tone in his voice. "Barbara, the receptionist, had the radio on this morning listening to some call-in advice program. Anyway, she said some woman named Karen was one of the callers, and she sounded a lot like you and talked about meeting a guy on a cruise ship 2 years ago. Anything you haven't told me?" The joking tone disappeared. "Carolyn, I want an answer. Anything I should know about that cruise?" Carolyn had felt her palms become clammy. She could hear a question in his voice, a suspicion, the sound that was the sign of mounting anger. She laughed it off, assuring him that she didn't have time to listen to the radio in the middle of the day. But given Jason's past history of almost obsessive jealousy, she worried that she hadn't heard the last of this. Now all she wanted to do was get the ring and this photo out of her life for good. The traffic was unusually heavy, even for that time of day. At Park Avenue, even though the light turned green, she was forced to wait at the front of an impatient throng of pedestrians as cars and vans continued to spin around the corner. Pedestrians have the right of way, she thought. Sure. A delivery van was turning, its brakes screeching. Instinctively, she tried to step back away from the curb. She could not retreat. Someone was standing directly behind her, blocking her way. Suddenly, she felt a hand grab the envelope from under her arm just as another hand shoved against the small of her back. Carolyn teetered on the edge of the sidewalk. Half turning, she glimpsed a familiar face and managed to whisper no as she tumbled forward and under the wheels of the van. He had waited for her outside the building in which Susan Chandler had her office. The minutes ticked by, and she still failed to appear. But fortunately, he had remembered her name and knew where she lived. So when Carolyn Wells didn't show up at Susan Chandler's office, he had phoned her home and then hung up when she answered. The instinct that had preserved him all these years had warned that even though she failed to keep the appointment today, she was still dangerous. He had gone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and sat on the steps. From there, he had a clear view of her apartment building. At 4 o'clock, his patience had been rewarded. The doorman had held open the ornate door, and she had emerged, carrying a small manila envelope under her arm. It was a bonus that the weather was so pleasant, and that the streets were so filled with pedestrians. He had been able to walk closely behind her, and even make out a few letters of the block printing on the envelope, Dr. S.U. He had guessed that the envelope contained the ring and the picture she had talked about when she called into the program. He knew he had to stop her before she reached the post office. His opportunity came at the corner of Park and 81st. Carolyn had half turned when he shoved her, and their eyes had met. She had known him as Owen Adams, a British businessman. On that trip he had sported a mustache, an auburn wig, and worn glasses and colored contact lenses. Even so, he was sure he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes just before she fell. With satisfaction, he remembered the screams and shrieks as observers watched her body disappear under the wheels of the van. It had been easy then just to slip away through the crowd, the envelope she had been carrying now hidden under his jacket. Even though he was anxious to see what she had put in it, he had waited until he was in the safety of his office with the doors locked before he ripped the envelope open. The ring and the picture were enclosed in a plastic bag. There was no letter or note with them. He studied the picture carefully. Encircling his prey, he had made the mistake of getting too close to Carolyn and ended up within camera range. He looked carefully at the photograph. Someone studying it with a trained eye might recognize him. He tossed the picture into the shredder and with grim satisfaction watched it transformed into unrecognizable strips. The ring he slipped on his pinky finger. He admired it, looked at it closer, then frowned and reached for a handkerchief with which to polish it. Another woman would very soon have the privilege of wearing the same ring, he told himself. He smiled briefly as he thought of his next, his final victim. Justin Wells found it impossible to concentrate after talking to his wife about the call to the radio station. Carolyn will be furious if she ever finds out what I'm doing, he told himself, as his fingers restlessly moved toward the phone on his desk. He had the number of the station. She'll never know, he assured himself. All I have to do is ask for a tape of today's Ask Dr. Susan program. I'll say it's my mother's favorite show, and she missed it today because she had a dentist appointment. He was put through to the office of Jed Genie, the producer of Ask Dr. Susan. He knew he sounded less than genuine when he gave the flimsy excuse that his mother had missed the program and that he wanted a tape for her. Jed Genie said that they were glad to oblige, because it was good to hear that a listener was that involved. Then he asked for his name and address. Feeling guilty and wretched, Justin Wells gave his name and the office address. He had barely hung up when he received a call from Lenox Hill Hospital informing him that his wife had been gravely injured in an automobile accident. Donald Richards' sprawling apartment on Central Park West was both his home and office. The rooms he used to see patients were accessible by a separate entrance from the corridor. The 5 rooms he reserved for himself had the distinctly masculine flavor of a home that had not known a woman's touch for a very long time. It had been 4 years since his wife, Kathy, a top model, died while on a photo shoot in the Catskills. He had not been there when it happened, and he certainly could not have done anything about it. Still, he had never stopped blaming himself. Most certainly, he had never gotten over it. The canoe in which Kathy had been posing overturned. The boat, with the photographer and his assistants, was 20 feet away. The heavy turn-of-the-century gown she had been wearing pulled her under before anyone could reach her. Divers never recovered her body. He dreamed of her frequently. Sometimes he saw her lying trapped under one of the rocky ledges in the frigid water, forever the sleeping beauty. At other times the dream changed. Her face dissolved and others replaced it, and they all whispered, "It was your fault." There was no reference to Kathy or what had happened to her on the book jacket for Vanishing Women. Under his picture, the brief bio reported that Dr. Donald Richards was a lifelong resident of Manhattan, had received his bachelor's degree from Yale, his MD and doctorate in clinical psychology from Harvard, and a master's degree in criminology from NYU. Following the Ask Dr. Susan program, he went directly home. His housekeeper had lunch waiting when he got in. As he ate, Don thought about Karen, the woman who had phoned during the broadcast, and then about Susan Chandler, who was an interesting and very attractive woman. "I'll call her and invite her to dinner," he decided. "Chances are she will be more open to talking about the case in an intimate atmosphere." Pamela Hastings hadn't spoken to her friend Carolyn Wells since the evening last week when she had held the turquoise ring in her hand and had experienced such an urgent sense of evil. As she turned the key in the lock of her apartment on Madison and 67th Street, she made a mental note to call her friend and tell her to get rid of the ring. She glanced at her watch. It was 10:05. She exchanged her conservative dark blue suit for comfortable slacks and one of her husband's shirts, fixed a scotch, and settled down to watch the news. In stunned disbelief, she listened as the off-camera commentator said, "This was the scene at Park and 81st, where a short time ago, apparently due to the pedestrian crush, 40-year-old Carolyn Wells fell into the path of a speeding van. She has been rushed to Lenox Hill Hospital with multiple head and internal injuries. Our reporter at the scene spoke with several of the eyewitnesses to the accident." As Pamela jumped to her feet, she heard the smattering of comments. "Oh, that poor woman! Terrible that people are allowed to drive like that." Then an elderly woman shouted, "You're all blind! She was pushed!" Pamela stared as the reporter pushed a microphone to that woman. "Would you give us your name, ma'am?" "Hilda Johnson. I was standing near her. She had an envelope under her arm. Some guy grabbed it and then he pushed her." "That's crazy! She fell!" another bystander yelled. Pamela ran for her coat. 15 minutes later, she was sitting beside Justin Wells in the waiting room outside the intensive care unit of Lenox Hill Hospital. 3 hours later, a doctor came in to speak to them. "Your wife is in a coma," he told Justin. "It's simply too soon to tell if she's going to make it, but when she was in the emergency room, she seemed to be calling for someone. It sounded like Wynne. Who would that be?" Pamela felt Justin's hand grab hers violently. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know." When 80-year-old Hilda Johnson returned to her apartment on East 80th Street, she called the police station. The desk sergeant who answered was one she had spoken to several times in the past, usually when she reported panhandlers approaching pedestrians on 3rd Avenue. He listened to her story patiently. "Hilda, we know what you think, but you're mistaken. The press of the crowd caused Mrs. Wells to lose her balance, that's all. The pressure of the hand on her back deliberately pushing her forward caused her to fall," Hilda snapped. "He grabbed the manila envelope she was carrying. I'm exhausted. I'm going to bed now, but leave word for Captain Shea. I'll be in to see him the minute he gets in tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock sharp." She hung up indignantly. It was only 5 o'clock, but she needed to go to bed. She felt a tightness in her chest that only a nitroglycerin tablet under her tongue and some bed rest would ease. Sleep overcame her just as she began to say Hail Mary for the gravely injured Carolyn Wells. Susan walked home through the twilight to her apartment on the top floor of a brownstone on Downing Street. It was a roomy place, with a large living room, generous kitchen, oversized bedroom, and small den. It always felt warm and welcoming to Susan, and tonight was no exception. In fact, this evening the place felt particularly soothing. An at-home night, she decided emphatically, as she proceeded to change, slipping into an aging velour caftan. She would make herself a salad and pasta and pour a glass of Chianti. A short time later, as she was rinsing watercress, the phone rang. "Susan, how's my girl?" It was her father. "I'm fine, Dad," Susan said, then grimaced. I'm fine, Charles. "Binky and I were sorry to have you leave so soon yesterday. Party was a blast, wasn't it?" Susan raised an eyebrow. "A real blast." "Susan, you certainly caught Alex Wright's eye. He kept talking to us about you. Guess he was praising you to your sister as well. Told us Dee wouldn't give him your home phone." "My office number is in the book. If he wants to, he can call me there. I thought he seemed like a nice guy." "He's a lot more than that. The Wright family is up there with the best of them. Very impressive. Let me put Binky on. She wants to tell you something." Her stepmother's trilling hello grated on her ear. Before she could respond, Binky began to sing the praises of Alexander Wright. "I've known him for years, darling. Never married. Just the kind of man Charles and I envision you or Dee with. Darling, I did something that I hope you won't mind. Alex just phoned and practically demanded I give him your home number, and I'm pretty sure he's going to call you this evening. Please tell me I did the right thing." "I'd rather you didn't give out my home number, Binky, but in this case I suppose it's all right. Just please don't do it again." Less than 10 minutes later, Alexander Wright phoned. "I made a point of catching your program today and thoroughly enjoyed it," he said. Susan was surprised to realize that she was pleased. "I was seated at the same table as Regina Clausen at a Futures Industry dinner 6 or 7 years ago. She struck me as a lovely person, a very intelligent lady." Wright hesitated, then said apologetically, "I know this is last minute, but I just finished a board of directors meeting and I'm hungry. If you haven't had dinner and don't have plans, could I possibly interest you in going out? I know you're on Downing Street. Il Molino is minutes away." Susan eyed the watercress she had been washing. Somewhat to her surprise, she heard herself agreeing to be picked up in about 20 minutes. Upon reflection, Douglas Layton acknowledged that Jane Clausen would not take kindly to his failure to stay with her at Dr. Susan Chandler's office. As a lawyer investment broker, for the past 4 years he had been working for the firm that handled the Clausen interests. He had begun his career there as assistant to Hubert March, the senior partner who had known and tended to the Clausens for some 50 years. As March approached retirement, Layton had become the on-the-spot person whom Jane Clausen clearly favored to replace her failing old friend. To have been named a director of the Clausen Family Trust after so short a time with the firm was an awesome coup, one which Douglas Layton fully appreciated, and with it came significant obligations. "But I had no choice this afternoon," he reminded himself as he entered the elevator of his apartment at 10 Park Avenue. He still rented, although with his income he could easily have afforded to buy his own place. He lived in a beautifully furnished apartment with a mahogany-paneled library, a living room with a dazzling New York view, a state-of-the-art kitchen, a large bedroom, and 2 full baths. Tonight, as he closed and locked the apartment door, Douglas Layton wondered how long his luck would hold out. He checked the time. It was 5:15. He made a beeline for the phone and called Jane Clausen. She did not answer, which was not unusual. If she was going out to dinner, she often would nap around this time, in which case the phone was always turned off. He went to the bar in the library and poured himself a stiff Scotch. As he gulped it down, he could feel his heart pounding. This was not the time to have an anxiety attack. Why was it that he, who usually was so absolutely in charge of his actions and emotions, got hit like this every so often? He knew why. Nervously, he flipped on the television and watched the evening news. At 7 o'clock, he once again dialed Jane Clausen's number. This time he reached her, but by her reserved tone, he knew he was in trouble. At 8 o'clock, he went out. As usual, Il Mulino was busy. The bar was filled with people waiting for tables, but the maitre d' escorted Susan and Alex to a table immediately. Without consulting the wine list, Alex ordered a bottle of Chianti and one of Chardonnay. At Susan's look of consternation, he laughed. "You don't have to have more than 1 glass or 2, but I promise you, you'll enjoy sipping both." Susan studied him briefly as he waved at someone across the room. He was dressed in a conservative dark gray suit with a faint pinstripe, a crisp white shirt, and a small patterned gray and red tie. He was attractive and impressive. Alex Wright certainly had the authority and poise that were the products of generations of breeding, but there was something else about him that intrigued her. "I think he's a little shy," she decided. That's what it is. She liked that about him. Over dinner, he told her that he was an only child, the product of a late marriage. "My father was too busy making money to court anyone until he was in his 40s. Then he was too busy amassing wealth to pay much attention to me or my mother. But I must assure you that with the human misery I read and hear about every day at the Foundation, I count myself very lucky." It wasn't until they were sipping espresso that Regina Clausen's name came up. "It seems impossible to think that someone with her background could just disappear," Alex commented. "Do you put any stock in that call you got on the program, the one from the woman who sounded so nervous?" Susan had already decided that she would not discuss with anyone the ring Regina Clausen's mother had given her. The fewer people who knew about it, the better. "I just don't know," she told him. "It's too early to be sure." "How did you ever happen to do a radio program in the first place?" he asked. She found herself telling him the whole story of working for Netta while in law school, quitting her job in the Westchester County DA's office, and going back to school. Finally, over brandy, Susan said, "I'm the one who's usually the listener. Enough about me. Much too much about me, in fact." Wright signaled for the check. "Not nearly enough." he said briskly. All in all, it had been a very nice evening, Susan decided as she slipped into bed. Alex had insisted on going upstairs with her and waiting while she opened her apartment door. Nothing like a little old-fashioned courtesy, she thought as she turned off the light. She was tired, but found she could not stop reviewing the events of the day. Would she ever hear from Karen again, she wondered? Would it be wise to make a plea on tomorrow's show for the woman to contact her, if only by phone? Hilda Johnson slept for 5 hours before she awoke at 10:30 that evening, feeling both refreshed and somewhat hungry. A cup of tea and a piece of toast would go down well, she decided. Over the years, she often had taken a pad and pen with her to the park and made pen and ink drawings that she would frame and give to her friends for their birthdays. She hadn't done it lately, though. Still, if she could get that man's face down on paper now while it was still fresh in her mind, it would be that much easier when she went to the police in the morning. With painfully stiff fingers, Hilda slowly began to draw. When she put the pen down 20 minutes later, she thought, "Not bad, not bad at all." She glanced at the clock. It was 5 of 11. She turned on the television, then went into the kitchen to fill the kettle. She had just lit the gas beneath it when the buzzer sounded from downstairs. Who in the name of God could it be at this hour? She wondered as she went into the tiny foyer and picked up the receiver of the intercom. Who is it? She did not attempt to conceal her irritation. Miss Johnson, I'm so sorry to disturb you. I'm Detective Anders. We have a suspect in custody who may be the person you saw push Mrs. Wells today. I need to show you his picture. If you recognize him, we can hold him. Otherwise, we'll have to let him go. I thought no one believed me when I said someone pushed her, Hilda snapped. We didn't want it to leak that we were on the trail of a suspect. May I come up for just a minute? I guess so. Hilda pushed the buzzer that unlocked the lobby door. Then, with a feeling of self-satisfaction, she went back to the desk and looked at her sketch. Wait till Detective Anders sees this, she thought. She waited until he rang the bell before she opened the door. Must be getting cold, she thought. His collar was turned up, and he wore a slouch hat pulled down low over his forehead. Plus, he was wearing gloves. This will only take a minute, Miss Johnson, he said. I'm sorry to disturb you. Come in, she said briskly. I got something to show you, too. She led the way to her desk. She didn't hear the soft click of the closing door. I did a sketch of the guy I saw, she said triumphantly. Let's compare it with the picture you have. Of course, he said. But instead of a sketch, the visitor laid down a driver's license with a photo ID. Hilda gasped. Look, it's the same face. That's the man I saw push that woman and grab the envelope. For the first time, she looked directly up at Detective Anders. He had removed his hat, and his coat collar was no longer turned up around his neck. Hilda's eyes widened in shock. Her mouth opened, but the only sound that came from it was a faint murmur. Oh, no! Beseechingly, she raised her hands. Then, in futile protest, she turned her palms outward to shield herself from the knife her visitor was about to plunge into her chest. He jumped back to avoid the spurting blood, and watched as her body sagged and crumbled to the threadbare carpet. As he reached over to take his driver's license and her sketch, her body shuddered violently, and her hand fell on his shoe. Shaking the hand off, he walked calmly to the door, opened it, checked the hallway, and in 4 paces was at the fire exit staircase. When he reached the lobby, he opened the door a crack, saw no one coming, and an instant later was on the street, heading home. Susan's sleep was restless, filled with troubling dreams. When she awoke, she remembered fragments of scenes in which Jane Clausen and Dee and Jack and she were all present. She remembered that at one point Jane Clausen had been pleading, "Susan, I want Regina," while Dee stretched out her hand and said, "Susan, I want Jack." Well, you had Jack, Susan thought. She got out of bed and stretched, hoping to relieve the familiar clutch at her heart. It bothered her deeply that after all these years a dream like that could bring all the memories flooding back. Memories of herself at 23, a second-year law student working part-time for Netta. Jack, a 28-year-old commercial photographer just beginning to make a name for himself. The two of them in love. Enter Dee, big sister, darling of fashion photographers, sophisticated, amusing, charming, 3 men in line wanting to marry her, but she had wanted Jack. And she got him, for a while at least. Then, at the ski slope, the avalanche that took Jack's life. Susan made coffee and turned on the television. A reporter was talking about an elderly woman who had been stabbed to death in her Upper East Side apartment. She was just about to turn off the TV when the anchor man replayed the segment from the previous evening's news that included the report that Hilda Johnson, the murder victim, had called the police, claiming that the woman who had been run over on Park Avenue had been deliberately pushed during a mugging. Susan stared at the television, realizing that the prosecutor in her was refusing to believe that these two events were coincidental, while the psychologist in her was wondering what kind of out-of-control mind could commit 2 such brutal crimes. He slept only fitfully, awaking several times during the night. Each time he turned on the TV, which remained tuned to the local news station, New York 1, and each time he heard the same thing. Carolyn Wells, the woman who had been run over at Park Avenue and 81st Street, was in a coma. Her condition was critical. He knew that if by some unlucky circumstance she recovered, she would tell people that she had been pushed by Owen Adams, a man she had met while on a cruise. They couldn't trace Owen Adams to him, of that he was certain. The British passport, like all the ones he had used on his special journeys, was a fake. No, the real danger lay in the fact that even without glasses, a mustache, and a wig, at close range he had been recognized by Carolyn Wells yesterday. Which meant that if she recovered, it wasn't impossible that they might run into each other in New York again some day. In a face-to-face situation, she would recognize him again. That must never happen. So, clearly, she could not be allowed to recover. There was no news about Hilda Johnson on any of the newscasts during the early hours, so her body hadn't been discovered. Then, on the news at 9, it was announced that an elderly woman had been stabbed to death in her Upper East Side apartment. Frowning, he pointed the remote control and turned off the television. If they tied Hilda Johnson's death to Carolyn Wells' supposed accident, there could be a media stampede. It might even come out that Carolyn Wells had been the one who phoned Susan Chandler's program and talked about a souvenir ring with the inscription, "You belong to me." It was even possible that the little gnome who ran that rat trap of a cut-rate souvenir store in Greenwich Village might remember that on several occasions a particular gentleman, whose name he knew, had come in to purchase one of the turquoise rings with that inscription. Dr. Donald Richards had agreed to do a second Ask Susan program on Tuesday. He arrived at the studio 20 minutes early and was told by the receptionist that Dr. Chandler was on her way and that he could wait in the green room. In the corridor, he ran into the producer, Jed Genie. "I didn't think to ask for a tape of yesterday's program for my files," Donald said. "Oh, and could you run one today as well?" "Sure. Actually, I'm just about to make a tape of yesterday's program for some guy who phoned in. Says he wants it for his mother. Come on, I'll run one for you as well." Richards followed him into the engineer's booth. "You could tell this guy felt like a jerk for asking," Jeannie continued, "but he claims his mother never misses listening to Susan. He held up the envelope he already had addressed. "Why does that name sound familiar?" he asked Richards. "I've been racking my brains trying to remember where I've heard it." Donald Richards had to force himself not to show how startled he was. He thought back to one of the visits he had had from Justin Wells. It had been the usual exploratory session, and Wells never came back. Richards remembered that he had phoned Wells, urging him to get into treatment with someone else, saying that he needed help, a lot of help. Then, having made the appropriate gestures, he had been vastly relieved. The truth was that for a very personal reason, he was better off avoiding contact with Justin Wells. For the first part of the program, they discussed how women could protect themselves and avoid getting into potentially dangerous situations. Soon it was time to take calls from the listeners. The first one was an inquiry about yesterday's show. "Did Karen keep her appointment at your office, Dr. Susan?" "No, she did not," Susan said. "But if she's listening, I'm going to ask her please to get in touch with me, even if only by phone." Several calls were directed to Donald Richards. The next call shocked Susan. "Dr. Richards, is the reason you wrote the book about vanishing women because your own wife disappeared?" Susan looked at Richards, waiting for a sign that she should cut off the call. "Doctor, you don't have to answer," she began. Instead, Richards shook his head. "My wife didn't actually disappear, at least not in the sense we've been discussing. She died in an accident in front of witnesses. We've never been able to retrieve her body, but there is no connection between her death and my book." His tone was controlled, but Susan could see raw emotion in the expression on his face. Her instant reaction was that whether he admitted it to himself or not, there had been a connection between his wife's death and the subject of his book. She looked at the monitor. "Our next call is from Tiffany in Yonkers. You're on, Tiffany." "Dr. Susan, I love your program," the caller began. She had a strong, animated voice. "Thank you, Tiffany. How can we help you?" "Well, I was listening to your program yesterday, and you remember how that woman, Karen, talked about getting a souvenir turquoise ring from some guy and said that the inside of the band was inscribed, 'You belong to me'?" "Yes, I do," Susan quickly said. "Do you know something about that man?" Tiffany began to giggle. "Dr. Susan, if Karen is listening, I just want her to know that she was lucky not to bother with that guy. He must have been some cheapskate. My boyfriend bought a ring just like that for me as a joke one day last year when we were in Greenwich Village. It looked good, but it cost all of $10. "Where in the village did you buy it?" "Gee, I don't remember exactly. One of those dumpy little souvenir stores, the kind that sells plastic Statue of Liberties. You know the kind of place." "Tiffany, if you do remember where it was, or if any of our other listeners know about the shop, please call me." "The little guy who runs the shop told us he made the rings himself," Tiffany said. "Listen, I broke up with my boyfriend, so you can have the ring. I'll mail it to you." "Commercial," Jed warned into Susan's earphone. "Many thanks, Tiffany, and now for a message from our sponsors." The moment the program was over, Donald Richards stood up. "Again, thanks, Susan, and forgive me if I rush off. I have a client waiting." Then he hesitated. I'd really like to have dinner with you sometime. How about tomorrow?" She said yes, and he quickly left. Susan sat for a moment, gathering her notes and thinking about the last call. Was it possible that the souvenir ring Jane Clausen had found among Regina's possessions had been purchased in the city? If so, did that mean that the man responsible for her disappearance was from New York? Still deep in concentration, she got up and went into the control room. Jeannie was putting a cassette into an envelope. "Richards got out fast. I guess he forgot he'd asked me to make tapes of the program, so I'll mail them with this one." He pointed to the envelope addressed to Justin Wells. "That guy phoned yesterday to get a tape of the program. Said his mother missed it. Flattering, Susan observed. See you tomorrow. In the cab on the way back to the office, she opened the newspaper. On page 3 of the Post, there was a picture of Carolyn Wells, an interior designer who had been injured in the accident yesterday afternoon on Park Avenue. Susan read the story with keen interest. Further down the column, she read, Husband, well-known architect Justin Wells. A moment later, she was on the cell phone to the station. She caught Jed Genie just as he was leaving for lunch. Susan asked him to send the package addressed to Justin Wells to her by messenger. Susan mentally reviewed her day. She had back-to-back appointments all afternoon. But after that, she would take the tape to Lenox Hill Hospital, where, according to the Post, Justin Wells was keeping vigil at his wife's bedside. He may not want to talk to me, Susan thought, as she paid the cabby, but there's no question. Whatever reason he has for wanting a tape of yesterday's program, it isn't because his mother missed it. In his tiny souvenir shop on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village, Abdul Parki often wondered about the man who had come back on 3 different occasions to purchase turquoise rings with the inscription, "You belong to me." It amused Abdul to think that this customer regularly changed girlfriends. The last time the man had been in, his business card had fallen from his wallet. Abdul had picked it up and glanced at it, then apologizing for being forward, he returned it. Seeing the look of displeasure on his customer's face, he had apologized again, calling the customer by name. Immediately, he knew he had made a second mistake. He doesn't want me to know who he is, and now he won't come back. That had been Abdul's immediate and regretful thought. And given the fact that a year had passed without a reappearance, he suspected that to be the case. Abdul closed the shop every day promptly at 1 o'clock, then went out for lunch. On this Tuesday afternoon, he had the sign in his hand, closed, return at 2 p.m., and was just about to put it on the door when his mysterious customer suddenly appeared, came inside, and greeted him warmly. Abdul broke into a rare smile. "It's been a long time, sir. It's good to see you again." "Good to see you, Abdul. I thought surely you would have forgotten me by now." "Oh, no, sir." "Bet you can't remember my name." "Of course I remember it, sir," he said. Smiling, he proved that indeed he did. "Good for you. Abdul, guess what? I need another ring. You know the one I mean. Hope you have one in stock." "I think I have 3, sir." "Well, maybe I'll take them all. Here, I'm keeping you from your lunch. Before any other customers show up, why don't we put the sign out and lock the door? Otherwise you'll never get out of here, and I know you're a creature of habit." Abdul smiled again, pleased at the thoughtfulness of this remarkably friendly old customer. Willingly, he handed him the sign and watched him turn the lock. It was then that he noted with surprise that, even though it was a mild and sunny day, his customer was wearing gloves. The handmade items were inside the glass-topped counter near the cash register. Abdul went to the counter and removed a small tray. "2 of them are here, sir. There's one more in the back, on my workbench. I'll get it." With quick steps, he walked through the curtained area that led to the small stockroom. The 3rd turquoise ring was in a box. Abdul turned, the ring in his hand, then gasped in surprise. His customer had followed him into the stockroom. "Did you find the ring?" "Right here, sir." Abdul held it out, not understanding why he suddenly felt nervous and cornered. When he saw the sudden flash of the knife, he understood. "I was right to be afraid," he thought, as he felt a sharp pain and then slipped into darkness. At 10 minutes of 3, just as her 2 o'clock patient was leaving, Susan Chandler received a call from Jane Clausen. "I need to discuss some problems I'm having, and I feel that I'd be very comfortable talking them over with you. I'm afraid it's very important that I see you as soon as possible, even today if that can be arranged. I'll be free at 5 o'clock, Mrs. Clausen. Thank you. I'll be there. As soon as she broke the connection, Susan dialed Lenox Hill Hospital and asked for the intensive care unit waiting room. A woman answered. Susan asked if Justin Wells was there. "Who's calling?" "Dr. Susan Chandler," she said. "Mr. Wells requested a tape of a radio program I did yesterday, and I wanted to bring it to him myself if he's still going to be at the hospital at 6:30. From the muffled sound in her ear, she could tell that the woman had covered the receiver with her hand. Even so, she could make out the question being asked. "Justin, did you request a tape of Dr. Susan Chandler's program yesterday?" She could hear the answer distinctly. "That's ridiculous, Pamela. Someone's playing a sick joke." "Dr. Chandler, I'm afraid there's been a mistake." The connection was broken, and Susan sat for a long minute staring at the phone. Had the request for the tape been intended as a practical joke, and if so, why? Or had Justin Wells made the call and now needed to deny it to the person he addressed as Pamela? And again, if so, why? Doug Layton stood outside the partly open door of the small office Jane Clausen kept for herself in the Clausen Family Trust Suite in the Chrysler Building. He didn't even have to strain to hear what she was saying on the phone to Dr. Susan Chandler. As he listened, he began to perspire. He was fairly certain that he was the problem she wanted to discuss with Chandler. Judging from her ashen appearance this morning, there was no question that Jane Clausen's condition was worsening. She had cancer and was dying. I should never have left her alone with Chandler at the radio station, he thought. I had everything under control, and then I blundered. He went into the men's room and dashed cold water on his face, combed his hair, straightened his tie, and looked in the mirror. He always had been grateful for his handsome features. Dark blonde hair, steel-gray eyes, and an aristocratic nose. Now he was sure that in his Paul Stewart jacket and slacks and maroon and blue tie, he looked the part of the trusted adviser who would handle the affairs of the late Jane Clausen in the manner she would have wanted. There was no question that on her death, Hubert March would turn the running of the trust over to him. Everything had gone so well until now. In her final days, Jane Clausen could not be allowed to interfere with his master plan. In Yonkers, 25-year-old Tiffany Smith was still stunned that she had actually gotten through to Dr. Susan Chandler herself and had talked to her live on air. A waitress on the evening shift at the Grotto, a neighborhood trattoria, she was famous for never forgetting a customer's face or what they had ordered at previous dinners. Yesterday, when she heard the woman who called herself Karen talk with Dr. Susan about the turquoise ring some guy had given her on a cruise, she thought immediately about Matt Bauer, who had given her a similar ring. After they broke up, she tried to pretend that the sentiment engraved on it, "You belong to me," was stupid and gooey, but she didn't really mean it. The phone call to Dr. Susan this morning had been an impulse, and almost immediately she regretted telling her that Matt was a cheapskate. She admitted to herself that she had made that remark only because Matt had dropped her. As the day wore on, Tiffany realized that the name of the shop where they bought the ring was not going to come to her. But she still remembered the attractive man she had seen in the shop that day. She figured he was the kind who went out with the people she only read about in the columns. She remembered the look of surprise on his face when he turned around and saw her standing there. After the man left, the store owner said, "That gentleman has purchased several of these rings for his lady friends. Maybe you'd like to see one." It was pretty, Tiffany thought, and she knew Matt could see by the amount rung up on the cash register that it only cost $10, so she didn't mind telling him she'd like to have it. Then the owner showed them the inscription, Tiffany remembered, and Matt had blushed and said that was fine, and she thought maybe it was a sign that this time she'd met a guy who would last. "But then we broke up," she thought ruefully. Wistfully, she looked at the turquoise ring. I'm not going to send it to Dr. Susan, she thought. Who knows? Maybe Matt will call me up sometime. Maybe he still doesn't have a steady girlfriend. But I promised Dr. Susan I'd send it, she reminded herself. So what shall I do? Wait a minute. What Dr. Susan really seemed interested in was the location of the shop. So instead of sending the ring, maybe I can just narrow down the location enough to help her. I remember that there was a porno shop across the street, and I'm pretty sure it was only a couple of blocks away from the subway station. She's smart. She should be able to find it with that information. Relieved that she had made the proper decision, Tiffany wrote Dr. Susan a note describing the location of the shop as she remembered it and explaining why she was hanging on to the ring. She signed the note, Your sincere admirer, Tiffany. By then, she was running late, as usual, and didn't take the time to drop the letter in the mailbox. Maybe she'd call Dr. Susan tomorrow instead of writing. Once she was on the air, she could explain that she wanted to apologize for making the crack about the ring being cheap, that she only said it because she missed Matt so much. He was such a nice guy, and could Dr. Susan suggest some way they might get together again? That way, maybe I'll get some free advice, she thought. Or maybe Matt's mom or one of her friends will be listening and hear his name and tell him, and he'll be flattered and give me a call. Alex Wright lived in the 4-story brownstone on East 78th Street that had been his home since childhood. It was still furnished as his mother had left it, with dark, heavy Victorian furniture, rich brocades, antique Persian carpets, and graceful objets d'art. Visitors exclaimed about the traditional beauty of the turn-of-the-century mansion. Alex said he had not redecorated the brownstone for one reason only. At some point, he intended to get married, and when that happened, he would leave any changes to his wife. He lived relatively simply, never having been comfortable with a staff of servants in the house. Now he employed only a chauffeur and a marvelously efficient and blessedly quiet housekeeper. Single, attractive, and with the allure of the right fortune behind him, Alex had always been firmly entrenched on the social A-list. Nonetheless, he had maintained a relatively low public profile because while he enjoyed interesting dinner parties, he abhorred personal publicity and always avoided the big society events that some people found exhilarating. When he arrived home that evening from the Foundation headquarters, the answering machine was on, so he decided to let it screen his calls. He raised his eyebrows when Dee Chandler Harriman announced herself. "Alex, I hope you don't mind. I asked Dad for your home number. I just wanted to thank you for being so nice to me the other day at Binky and Dad's cocktail party. I've been down a lot lately, and although you don't know it, you really helped just by being a nice guy. I'm going to try and kill the blues by going on a cruise next week. Anyhow, thank you. I just had to let you know. Oh, by the way, just for the record, here's my phone number." I guess she doesn't know I asked her sister out to dinner, Alex thought. Dee is gorgeous, but Susan is much more interesting. Yes, Susan Chandler was interesting. In fact, she had been on his mind all day. When Jane Clausen arrived for their meeting, the ashen complexion of her visitor reinforced Susan's realization of how seriously ill the woman was. "Dr. Chandler," Mrs. Clausen began. "Please call me Susan. Dr. Chandler sounds so formal," Susan said with a smile. Jane Clausen nodded. "You met my lawyer yesterday, Douglas Layton. What did you think of him?" "He seemed nervous," she said. "And were you surprised that he didn't wait with me?" "Yes, I was." "Why were you surprised?" "Because it was entirely possible that you were going to meet a woman who might have shed light on your daughter's disappearance. Perhaps even a woman who could have described a man who might have been involved in that disappearance. It was potentially a very significant moment for you. I should have expected him to stay with you for support." Jane Clausen nodded. "Exactly, Susan. I did some checking today. The Laytons of Philadelphia are indeed his second cousins, but they say they scarcely remember him. He, on the other hand, has spoken at length of his familiarity with them. It turns out that his father, Ambrose Layton, was a ne'er-do-well who went through his inheritance in a few years, then disappeared. Today, I realized he was eavesdropping when I spoke with you. The door was partially open, and I could see him reflected in the glass of the cabinet. I was terribly startled. Why would he do that? What reason has he to skulk around me? Did you ask him? No, I don't want to put him on guard. I'm going to have a grant audited. It was one we were reviewing at today's meeting, an orphanage in Guatemala. Doug is scheduled to go there next week and present a report at the next trustees' meeting. I questioned the amounts we've been giving, and Douglas blurted out that Regina had told him it was one of her favorite charities. He said it as though it had been thoroughly discussed between them, yet he previously told me he had never met her. You see, Susan, I need to share this with you because I have suddenly realized one possible reason why Douglas Layton rushed out yesterday. Susan knew what Jane Clausen was about to tell her, that Douglas Layton had been afraid to come face to face with Karen. Alex Wright phoned Dee back later that evening. When she replaced the receiver 10 minutes later, she was smiling. He had called because he was concerned. He said she sounded so down and he thought she might want to chat. He explained that he had enjoyed his evening with Susan and was about to invite her to a dinner Saturday night, celebrating a recent grant from the Wright Foundation to the New York Public Library. Dee congratulated herself on her quick thinking. She had told him that on her way to Costa Rica to board the cruise, she was going to stop in New York and would be there over the weekend. Alex had taken the hint and invited her to dinner too. After all, Dee told herself, it isn't as if Susan is really involved with him yet. After Jane Clausen left her office on Tuesday evening, Susan went over paperwork until nearly 7. The day had been tiring, and she was tempted to hail a cab. She resisted, however, and walked home as usual. Tonight is definitely stay-at-home night, she decided. Later, while the water for the pasta was heating and the basil and tomato sauce was defrosting in the microwave, she turned on her home computer and checked her email. On impulse, she checked to see if Dr. Donald Richards had a website. He did. With increasing interest, Susan zeroed in on the personal information. A long list of published articles followed, as well as reviews of his book, Vanishing Women. Then Susan found information that raised her eyebrows. A brief biography stated that Dr. Richards had spent a year between his junior and senior years in college working on a round-the-world ocean liner as assistant cruise director, and that he frequently took short cruises. As his favorite ship, he named the Gabrielle, noting that that was the one on which he had met his wife. Susan stared at the screen. "But that's the same ship Regina Clausen was on when she disappeared," she said aloud. Pamela stayed with Justin Wells in the waiting room of the ICU at Lenox Hill Hospital until nearly midnight. At that time, a doctor came out and urged them both to go home. "Your wife has stabilized somewhat," he told Justin. "Her condition may not change for weeks. You won't do her any favors if you get sick yourself." "Has she tried to talk any more?" Justin asked. "No, nor will she any time soon. Not as long as she remains in this deep coma." "Justin sounds almost afraid that she'll talk. What's that about?" Pamela wondered, then decided that she was so tired her brain was playing tricks. She took Justin's hand. "We're going," she said. "We'll get a cab and I'll drop you off." He nodded, and like an obedient child let her lead him out. On the short ride to 5th and 81st Street, he sat hunched forward. "We're here, Justin," Pamela said when the taxi stopped. He turned and looked at her, his eyes dull. "All of this is my fault. I called Carolyn a little while before the accident. I know I upset her. She probably wasn't paying attention to the traffic. If she dies, I'll feel like I killed her." Before Pamela could answer, he was out of the cab. But what could I tell him? She wondered. If Justin had reverted to one of his jealous or suspicious moods when he called, then indeed Carolyn would have been distracted and upset. But she wouldn't have been so foolish as to show him that turquoise ring and talk about the man who gave it to her, would she? And why in the name of God would he have wanted a tape of the Ask Dr. Susan program, she wondered. That made no sense at all. Was it possible that the old woman on the television had been right? That Carolyn had been pushed? And if so, was Justin, for his own reasons, trying to set up the belief that she had been distracted and unwittingly stepped into the path of the van? Then Pamela remembered something she had dismissed at the time. 2 years ago, before she went on the cruise, Carolyn had said, "Justin's insecurity about our relationship is so deep that sometimes I'm afraid of him." Sometimes at night he took long walks. This afternoon had gone easily enough. The proprietor of the souvenir shop had died quietly. There had been nothing about his death on the evening news programs yet. He was almost surprised to find himself near Downing Street. Susan Chandler lived on Downing. Was she in now, he wondered? He realized that his walking here tonight, in a relatively unconscious state, was an indication that he could not allow her to keep making trouble. Since yesterday morning, he'd had to eliminate 2 people, Hilda Johnson and Abdul Parki, neither of whom he had ever intended to kill. A third, Carolyn Wells, was either going to die or would have to be eliminated should she ever recover. Even though she didn't know his real name, if she were able to talk, he had no doubt she would tell the police that the man she knew as Owen Adams on the cruise was the one who had pushed her. Even though all the credentials for Owen Adams were untraceable to him, he couldn't afford to let it go that far. Of course, as long as she was in a coma, she posed no immediate danger. The real danger might be Tiffany, the girl who had called into Dr. Susan Chandler's program today. As he walked along Downing Street, he cursed himself. He remembered his visit last year to Parky's shop. He had thought it was empty. From the sidewalk, he hadn't been able to see that young couple standing behind the screen. The minute he had noticed them, he knew he had made a mistake. The girl, one of those boldly attractive young women, had been eyeing him, sending signals that she found him attractive. It wouldn't matter, except he was sure she could recognize him if she saw him again. If Tiffany and that girl from the shop were the same person, she had to be silenced. Tomorrow he would find a way to learn from Susan Chandler if this Tiffany person had sent the ring, and if so, what she had written to accompany it. When would it end, he thought. One thing for certain, by next week, Susan Chandler must be stopped. On Wednesday morning, Oliver Baker was both nervous about being in the police station and thrilled by his role as witness. He had spent Monday night enthralling his wife and teenage daughters with his story of how, if he had been a few feet nearer to the curb, he might have been the one to start across the street first and been hit by the van. A mild, eager-to-please man in his mid-50s, Oliver was the 10th witness the police had interviewed, and like most of the accounts, his story differed somewhat from the others. Hilda Johnson had been the only one who definitely had insisted that Carolyn Wells had been pushed. Now Hilda was dead. It was Oliver's belief that Carolyn Wells was on her way to the post office. "What makes you think that?" Captain Tom Shea asked. "Because she had a stamped manila envelope under her arm," Oliver answered. "You're sure of that?" "Yeah, I'm sure. I think it started to slip because just as the light changed, she began to turn, then lost her balance. The man behind her tried to steady her, I think, and that's how he happened to take the envelope. The old woman was all wrong about the way it happened. I wonder if that man mailed it for her. That's what I would have done." "Did you get a good look at him, at this man who took the envelope?" "Yeah, well, he had on a top coat, a Burberry, or one that looked like a Burberry." When Oliver Baker had left, Captain Shea leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his chest. His gut instinct was telling him that there was a connection between Hilda Johnson's insistence that Carolyn Wells had been pushed and Hilda's own death only hours later. On Wednesday morning, Doug Layton set his strategy into place. He knew he had a long way to go to placate Jane Clausen before he left on the trip, but during the sleepless early morning hours, he had worked out a story. He had always been able to talk himself out of trouble. This time, however, the stakes were enormous. When he showed up at Jane Clausen's Beekman Place townhouse, he did not give her a chance to speak. "Mrs. Clausen, I've been terribly troubled that you misunderstood me yesterday. I was mistaken when I said Regina had told me the orphanage in Guatemala was a favorite charity of hers. It was Mr. March who explained a great deal about that orphanage and about how Regina was so touched by the plight of the children there." It was a safe enough story. March wouldn't remember having said it, of course, but he also would be afraid to deny it because of his growing awareness of his own forgetfulness. "Hubert was the one who told you?" Mrs. Clausen asked. "He was like an uncle to Regina. It was just the sort of thing she would confide in him." It was though he was watching ice melt. "She wants to believe me," Doug thought, mentally congratulating himself. There was just one more area he had to cover. "I have an apology to make about leaving you unescorted at Dr. Chandler's office on Monday. I did have an appointment of long standing, but I should have broken it. The problem was, I could not reach the client, and she was coming in from Connecticut to meet me." "I gave you very short notice," Jane Clausen said. When he left a few minutes later, Douglas smiled to himself. He was back in the good graces of Jane Clausen, and once again on the road to the chairmanship of the Clausen Family Trust. One thing was certain. From now on, and most certainly during the time left to Jane Clausen, he wouldn't make any more mistakes. One thing still bothered him, however. What had Jane Clausen talked about to Dr. Chandler? Besides being a psychologist, Chandler had a trained legal mind. He couldn't help but be concerned, because she would be the first one to seize on something that didn't ring true. He glanced at his watch. It was 8:20. He should be at the office before 9. That would give him a good hour to get some paperwork out of the way before it was time to listen to today's installment of Ask Dr. Susan. In the interest of saving time, Susan decided against her usual walk and took a cab to the office, arriving at 7:15. She got to work immediately, and for the next hour she caught up on correspondence, then prepared to put in motion the plan she had made the night before. She had decided to go to Justin Wells' office and confront him about the tape and about her belief that his wife was the mysterious caller. Susan scanned the rest of her notes, cataloging points that still concerned her. Elderly witness to Carolyn Wells' accident. Had Hilda Johnson been right when she declared that someone had pushed Carolyn? Equally significant, was Johnson's murder a few hours later another coincidence? Tiffany. She had called to say that she had a turquoise ring with an inscription identical to the ones Regina and Karen had. Would she send it in? I'll have to talk about her on the program today, Susan thought. That way, maybe she'll at least call in again, although actually I need to see her. If the ring is the same as the others, I've got to get her to come and meet me. She just has to remember where it was bought. The next notation on her list was about Douglas Layton. Jane Clausen had shown very real fear yesterday when she visited Susan and talked about him. Layton had acted suspiciously, Susan thought. The way he bolted minutes before Karen was due to arrive at the office. Was he afraid to meet her? And if so, why? The last item concerned Donald Richards. Was it just a coincidence that his favorite cruise ship was the Gabrielle, and that his book was about vanished women? Was there more to this seemingly pleasant man than met the eye? Later that morning, Susan was surprised to receive a call from Alex Wright. "I just wanted to tell you that I had a very enjoyable time with you Monday evening, and I'm hoping you're free again on Saturday night. Our foundation has made a grant to the New York Public Library, and there's going to be a black-tie dinner in the McGraw Rotunda at the main library on Fifth Avenue. It's not a big affair, only about 40 people. Originally I was going to beg off, but I really shouldn't, and if you'd come with me, I might actually enjoy it." "That's very kind of you. Yes, I am free, and I'd love to go." "That's great. I'll pick you up around 6:30 then, if it's okay." "Fine." His voice changed, suddenly hesitant. "Oh, Susan, by the way, I was talking to your sister." "Dee?" "Yes. I met her at Binky's party after you left. She phoned my apartment last night and left a strange message for me, and I returned the call. She's going to be in New York this weekend. I told her I was inviting you to the dinner and asked her to join us. She sounded pretty down about life." "That was kind of you," she replied. When she got off the phone, she couldn't help but remember how 7 years ago Dee had phoned Jack, telling him how upset she was with her new publicity photos and asking him to take a look at them and advise her. And that, Susan thought with a pang of bitterness, was the beginning of the end for Jack and me. Could history be repeating itself? She wondered. When Susan showed up at Justin Wells' office unannounced, she wasn't exactly surprised that he refused to see her. The receptionist, Barbara Gingas, who had first told Justin she had heard his wife calling the program, was only too happy, however, to listen to the tape and identify Carolyn's voice. As Susan watched, the receptionist bobbed her head excitedly. "Sure, that's Carolyn Wells. And even what she's talking about makes sense. I started work here just about the time she and Mr. Wells separated. I remember because he was a basket case. Then, when he made up with her, it was like day and night. You never saw a guy so happy." Susan put away the tape recorder. Her suspicions had been confirmed. Now she needed to figure out what to do next. "Just one more thing, Barbara. The Wellses have a friend named Pamela. Have you ever met her?" "Oh, you mean Dr. Pamela Hastings? She teaches at Columbia. She and Mrs. Wells are great buddies. I know she's been at the hospital a lot with Mr. Wells." Now Susan had learned everything she needed to know. "Thank you, Barbara." Donald Richards was driving north on the Palisades Parkway toward Bear Mountain. He turned on the radio and tuned in to Ask Dr. Susan. It was a program he had no intention of missing. When he reached his destination, he remained in the car until the program was over. Then he sat quietly for several minutes before getting out of the car and opening the trunk. He took a narrow box from inside and walked to the water's edge. The mountain air was cold and still. The lake surface shimmered under the autumn sun, but even so, there were dark areas that hinted at the water's depth. For a long time he sat on the ground at the lakeside, his hands clasped over his knees. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he ignored them. Finally, he opened the box and removed the dewy, fresh, long-stemmed roses that were nestled inside. One by one, he tossed them on the waters, until all 24 were floating there, undulating and separating as the slight breeze touched them. "Goodbye, Catherine." He spoke aloud, his tone somber. Then he turned and went back to the car. Once again, Susan saw disapproval in Jed Jeannie's eyes when she arrived at the studio only 10 minutes prior to broadcast time. "You know, Susan, one of these days," he began. "I know, one of these days you'll be starting without me, and that won't go over well." He gave her a reluctant half-smile. When the engineer announced the 30-second warning, Susan said quickly, Jed, remember that call from Tiffany yesterday? I don't expect to hear from her, but if she does call in, be sure to record her phone number when it comes up on the ID. As usual, the show went by quickly. Towards the end, Susan heard Jed in her headphones. Our next call is from Tiffany in Yonkers, Dr. Susan. Susan looked up at the control box. Jed was nodding. He would copy Tiffany's phone number from the caller ID. Tiffany, I'm so glad you called back today, Susan began, but she was interrupted before she could continue. Dr. Susan, Tiffany said hurriedly, I almost didn't have the courage to phone because I may disappoint you. You see... Susan listened with dismay to the obviously rehearsed speech about why Tiffany couldn't send her the turquoise ring. It sounded almost as though she were reading it. It was such a cute souvenir, and Matt, my former boyfriend, gave it to me, and it kind of reminds me of all the fun times we had when we went together. Tiffany, I wish you'd call me at my office, Susan said. She immediately had a sense of déjà vu. Hadn't she spoke these same words to Carolyn Wells 48 hours earlier? Dr. Susan, I won't change my mind about giving you the souvenir ring, and if you don't mind, I want to tell you that I work at... Please do not give your employer's name, Susan said. I work at the Grotto, the best Italian restaurant in Yonkers, Tiffany said defiantly. Cut to commercial, Susan, Jed barked into her headphones. At least now I know where to find her, Susan thought wryly as she automatically began to say, and now a message from our sponsors. When the program was over, she went into the control room. Jed had written Tiffany's phone number on the back of an envelope. Susan folded the envelope and put it in her jacket pocket. Are you going to contact her about that ring? Jed asked. Yes, I think so. I just need to compare it with the one Regina Clausen had. I know it's a long shot that they came from the same place, but I won't be sure unless I can check it out. Susan decided that the next thing she had to do was to talk to whoever on the police force was in charge of the investigation of Carolyn Wells's accident. Now that she was certain that it was Carolyn who called the show on Monday and identified herself as Karen, she had to find out if the police had given any credence to the version of the incident that the elderly woman had given them. The article she read in the Times this morning had reported that the investigation into both Carolyn's accident and Hilda Johnson's murder were being handled by the 19th Precinct. Clearly that was the place to start looking for answers. Susan immediately liked Police Captain Tom Shea, his lean, clean-cut features, the alert, intelligent expression in his dark brown eyes. She sensed that this was not the kind of police officer who wasted time. She quickly summarized her background and involvement in the case. A look of deep interest came over his face. Have you received a manila envelope that could have been from Carolyn Wells in the mail? Shea asked. Not as of yesterday. The mail wasn't in when I left my office this morning. Why? Because both Hilda Johnson and one other witness saw Carolyn Wells carrying a manila envelope, and the second witness thought it was addressed to Dr. something. Did you expect her to send anything to you? No, but then she might have decided to mail in the picture and the ring she promised to give me. Let me play the tape of her call for you. When it was finished, Susan looked across the desk and noted the intensity of Captain Shea's expression. You're a psychologist, Dr. Chandler. Would you agree that that woman is afraid of her husband? I would say that she is nervous about his reaction to what she told me. Captain Shea picked up the phone and barked out an order. See if we have any record of a complaint against a Justin Wells, probably something domestic, about 2 years ago. It took less than 5 minutes for Shea to find out. It's what I thought. I knew that what you told me rang a bell. Dr. Chandler, 2 years ago, Carolyn Wells swore out a complaint against Justin Wells, which she later withdrew. In the complaint, she contended that, in a jealous rage, her husband had threatened to kill her. Would you know if Wells had learned of that call she made to your program? Susan nodded. He not only learned of it, he phoned on Monday afternoon requesting a copy of the tape. Then, when I called him about it last night, he denied any knowledge of the request. I tried to deliver the tape to his office this morning, but he refused to see me. Dr. Chandler, I can't thank you enough for this information. The tape shows Carolyn Wells was afraid of her husband. My guess is that she didn't tell him anything about her relationship with the guy she met on the ship. I think when Wells heard about that program, he went nuts. I want to talk to him. I want to know where he was between 4 and 4:30 Monday afternoon. Susan knew that everything Captain Shea said made sense, but something still wasn't right. Every instinct in her body told her there must still be a connection between the man Carolyn had met on the trip and Regina Clausen's disappearance. As she left the police station, she decided there was one link she would follow up herself. She would track down Tiffany, whose phone number she had and who worked at the Grotto, the best Italian restaurant in Yonkers. After her second phone call to ask Dr. Susan, Tiffany was intensely pleased with herself. She had gotten across exactly the message she wanted, and now she just hoped that someone would report her call to Matt, and she was sure her boss would be thrilled when he heard about the plug she managed to get in for the Grotto. Later, she was struck by the sudden possibility. Suppose Matt showed up at the Grotto tonight? Just in case, she gave herself extra time getting ready for work and wore a blouse and a skirt that she knew looked really great on her. Maybe if Matt showed up, they could go someplace when she got off at midnight. She hesitated about wearing the turquoise ring that had inspired this moment of celebrity, then decided to put it on. But if Matt did show up and happened to mention it, she wouldn't make a fuss about it. She would just let him see it, casually. Tiffany had just opened the door to leave her apartment when the phone rang. It was Matt's mother. "Tiffany, I must insist that you stop talking about my son on the radio. Matthew took you out only a few times. He has just become engaged to a very attractive young woman he's been seeing for some time. So please forget him and do not talk about your dates with him, particularly where his friends or his fiancé will hear about it." A decisive click sounded in Tiffany's ear. In the car, the hurt and disappointment washed over her, and she could hardly breathe for the sobs that were racking her body. When she reached the Grotto, she chose a remote spot in the parking lot and sat for a moment in the car. Then she pulled out her compact and put on a new layer of foundation, fresh eyeshadow and lipstick. On the way to the kitchen door, she passed the dumpster. She paused for a moment and looked at it. In one sweeping gesture, she pulled the turquoise ring from her finger and tossed it inside, where it disappeared into a half-open plastic bag stuffed with lunchtime refuse. "Lousy ring brought me nothing but lousy luck," Tiffany muttered, and then ran to the kitchen door. When Susan returned to her office, a vase of fresh flowers sat on her credenza. As she crossed to them, her eyes widened. "There must be a mistake," she said. "That vase is Waterford." "No mistake," Janet assured her. "I tried to tip the guy who brought the bouquet, but he refused. He said it was from his employer. My guess is he was a chauffeur, or something like that." Of course. Alex heard something in my voice after he told me he had invited Dee along on Saturday night, Susan thought. That explains a gesture as grand as this. How perceptive of him, and how stupid of me to allow my feelings to be so transparent. The gift was beautiful, but her pleasure at receiving it was diminished by her understanding of the reason behind it. For a moment, she debated whether to call Alex right away to say that she couldn't possibly accept the vase. Then she shook her head. She could deal with all that later. Besides, tonight she was seeing Donald Richards. Late Wednesday afternoon, Justin Wells was appalled to find a message to call Captain Shea of the 19th Precinct to set up a visit to the station house to discuss his wife's accident. The message concluded ominously with the words, "You know where we are located." The memory of that terrible evening when Carolyn had sworn out a complaint against him was something Justin had never allowed himself to dwell on. "I shouldn't have threatened to kill her," he reminded himself as he crumpled the message in his hand. "I never meant to hurt her. I just grabbed her arm when she started walking out of the apartment. I didn't mean to twist it. It happened because she tried to pull away. One of the promises he had made to Carolyn at the time was to start therapy, and he had. But then he couldn't stand the thought of revealing himself to anyone, even to a sympathetic listener like Dr. Richards, and that was the end of that. Of course, he never told Carolyn. She thought he was still seeing Richards. Now Carolyn was in the hospital, still in a coma, and she kept trying to say someone's name. Wynne, it sounded like. Was that the guy she had gotten involved with on the ship? He wondered. The thought made Justin's chest feel as if it were going to explode. He could feel perspiration beating up on his forehead. The memory of that terrible night 2 years ago almost sickened him. The cops arresting him, bringing him to the station, handcuffed like a common thief. An hour later, he was giving his name to the desk sergeant at the 19th Precinct. Donald Richards was waiting at the bar at Palio when Susan arrived at 7:10. He cut short her apology. "Traffic was terrible. I just walked in the door myself." The maitre d' took them to their table. Susan looked around. The lighting in the 2-story room was subdued, the atmosphere both warm and sophisticated. She tried not to show how keenly she was studying Donald Richards as he looked at the menu. His hair was dark brown with just a touch of auburn. He was wearing wide glasses with a steel gray frame. The lenses enhanced his gray-blue eyes. She was sure he had changed for the evening. Yesterday and Monday, when he came to the studio, he had worn a blazer and slacks. Tonight, he was dressed in an obviously expensive dark blue suit and silver and blue tie. She was burning with questions and wondered if she would ever find a safe way to ask them. She couldn't let herself forget that he was a psychiatrist and would see through any effort to probe. "Did you ever hear anything more from Karen, the woman who called on Monday?" he asked. "No, I didn't," she said. "Did your producer send Justin Wells a copy of that program?" It was not a question Susan had expected. "Do you know Justin Wells?" "I've met him." "Personally or professionally?" "Professionally." "Were you treating him for excessive and dangerous jealousy of his wife?" "Why do you ask that?" "Because if the answer is yes, I think you have a moral obligation to tell what you know about him to the police. It turns out that the woman who called herself Karen is Justin Wells's wife, whose real name is Carolyn, and she fell or was pushed in front of a van a few hours after she called me." Donald Richards' expression was not so much surprised as grave and reflective. "I'm afraid you're probably right. I should speak to the police." "Captain Shea of the 19th Precinct is heading the investigation," Susan told him. There was a moment's silence. "I'm going to admit something, Susan. I looked you up on the internet." "I looked you up too," she laughed. "I was interested to see that you took a year off from college to work as an assistant cruise director. What exactly does an assistant cruise director do?" "He helps to organize and coordinate the shipboard activities, smooth ruffled feathers, spot lonely or unhappy people and draw them out. You name it." "According to your bio, you met your wife on the Gabrielle. It says also that it was your favorite ship. That was the ship Regina Clausen was traveling on when she disappeared." "Yes, I never met her, of course, but I can certainly understand why the Gabrielle would have been recommended to her. She's a wonderful ship." At some point he's going to tell me to stop the grilling, Susan thought. I better stop here, at least for now. During the course of their conversation, salad plates had been cleared and replaced by entrees. They had continued talking through the meal, niceties interspersed among the more obviously probing questions. When they left the restaurant, Richards hailed a cab. As they got in, he gave the driver her address. Then he looked at her sheepishly. "I'm not a mind reader. I saw that you're listed in the book." Once they had arrived at her apartment building, he had the cab wait while he escorted her upstairs. "Your mother would be pleased," Susan told him. A perfect gentleman. Good night, Susan. Then he was gone. She double-locked her door, then crossed to her answering machine. There were 2 messages. The first was from her mother. Susan listened to her fumbling explanation of how Alex Wright apparently had enjoyed meeting her at the party Sunday, but how Binky had been trying to set him up with Dee. We know that Dee is lonely and restless, but I'd hate to see her interfere with the friendship that you might be enjoying. She called me this afternoon to say that she's moving back to New York. She misses us, and she's tired of the modeling agency. Your father is treating her to a cruise next week. I hope that will pick up her spirits. The second message was from Alex Wright. A business meeting was canceled, and I worked up the nerve to try you on short notice again. Not very good manners, I know, but I did want to see you. I'll give you a call tomorrow. Smiling, Susan replayed the message. She was suddenly glad Dee had signed up for the cruise next week. It was nearly midnight, but Susan thought she'd try to reach Tiffany at the grotto. She got the phone number of the restaurant from information and dialed. Susan asked for Tiffany, then waited several minutes before she came on. Dr. Susan, I never want to hear a word about that stupid ring again. Matt's mother phoned and told me to stop talking about him. She said that he's getting married, so I threw the dumb ring away. No disrespect to you, but now I wish I hadn't been listening to your show that day. And I wish Matt and I had never even gone in that stupid souvenir shop. And I wish especially that we hadn't been listening when that man who ran that dumb place told us that the guy who'd just been in had brought these rings for several of his girlfriends. Tiffany, this is important. Did you see that man? Sure I did. He was a doll, class act, not like Matt. Tiffany, I have to talk to you. Come into the city tomorrow. We'll have lunch together, and please tell me, is it possible to get your ring back? Dr. Susan, by now it's under tons of chicken bones and pizza, and that's where it's gonna stay. Listen, I gotta go. My boss is giving me the evil eye. Tiffany, have you remembered where you bought that ring? Susan begged. I told you, in the village, the West Village. I knew it wasn't too far from a subway stop. The only thing I remember for certain about where it was is that there was a porn shop opposite. I gotta go. Bye, Dr. Susan. Susan replaced the receiver slowly. Tiffany had thrown away her turquoise ring, which was too bad, but she seemed to remember a man who apparently had bought several others. Susan decided that in the morning she would call her friend Chris Ryan, a former FBI agent. She had already planned to have him run a check on Douglas Layton so she could report to Jane Clausen. I'll give him Tiffany's home phone number as well, she thought. He'll be able to get her address for me, and if he can't, then tomorrow evening I'll be sitting in the grotto, having the best Italian food in Yonkers. It wasn't until she was outside that Tiffany remembered leaving her car in the far corner of the parking lot. What a pain, she thought. Something made her feel funny, made her want to get out of there as quickly as possible. As she walked rapidly towards her car, she fumbled in her bag for keys. Her fingers closed over them. She was almost there. Then suddenly, a man was standing in front of her. There was something shiny in his hand. A knife, she thought, the realization making her freeze almost in mid-step. No, she thought, disbelieving as she saw him move toward her. Why, she wondered, incredulous that this was happening. Please, she begged, please. Tiffany lived long enough to see her attacker's face, long enough for her excellent memory to help her recognize her killer as the classy guy she had glimpsed in the village souvenir shop, the one who had bought those rings inscribed, "You belong to me." As he drove back to the city, traveling along the Cross Bronx Expressway, he could feel the perspiration pouring from him. Chances are no one saw me, he kept thinking, and next week it will all be over, he reminded himself. He would choose someone to see the jungle when it's wet with rain, and his mission would be completed. Veronica, so trusting, she had been the first, now buried in Egypt, see the pyramids along the Nile. Regina, He had won her trust in Bali. Watch the sunrise on the tropic isle. Constance, who had replaced Carolyn in Algiers. See the marketplace in old Algiers. Fly the ocean in a silver plane. He thought of Monica, the timid heiress he had met on the flight to London. The rings had been a mistake, of course. He knew that now. They had been his private joke, like the connection between the names that he used on the special trips. He should have just kept his jokes to himself. But Parky, who made the rings, was out of the way. Now Tiffany, who had seen him buying one of them, was gone. He was certain that, like Carolyn, she had recognized him at the end. A week from tonight all this will be over, he promised himself. By then, I will have begun the last leg of my journey. Susan Chandler will have been eliminated, and I'll be starting my final cruise. Susan had finally gotten hold of Pamela Hastings, who had agreed to come by Susan's office Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. As Susan described talking about Regina Clausen's disappearance from a cruise and the call she had received from a listener who called herself Karen, Susan watched the concern deepen on Pamela's face. When she finished, the other woman said, "I saw a turquoise ring with that inscription last Friday night. Carolyn showed it to me." Briefly, she told Susan about the 40th birthday party. Susan opened the side drawer of her desk and extracted the turquoise ring. She held it out. Pamela Hastings paled. She did not attempt to take the ring from Susan's hand, but sat staring at it. Finally, she said, "It looks exactly like the one Carolyn showed me. Is the inside of this band engraved with the sentiment, 'You belong to me'?" "Yes. Here, look at it closely." Hastings shook her head. "No, I don't want to touch it. When I touched the ring Carolyn had the other night, I warned her that it might be the cause of her death." There was an awkward pause. "I think I should tell you that Carolyn seems to be calling for someone. A number of times she very clearly said, 'Win.' Then early this morning, according to the nurse, she said, 'Oh, Win.' You feel sure it was a name?" "I asked her that yesterday as I stood next to her holding her hand, and she pressed my palm. In fact, for a moment there I really thought she was about to regain consciousness." "Pamela, there's one other question I have to ask you now," Susan said. "Do you think that Justin Wells is capable of hurting his wife in a jealous rage?" Pamela thought for a moment. "I think he was capable of that. Maybe he still is, I don't know. But he's been absolutely distraught since Monday night, and now the police have been talking to him." Captain Tom Shea sent Detective Marty Power over to interview the friendly receptionist Barbara Gingas. In less than 3 minutes he had learned all about how Barbara heard Carolyn Wells on the Ask Dr. Susan program on Monday, and how she had told Mr. Wells about it when he came back from lunch. "I think he made him mad or upset or something," Barbara confided, "because later he went out without telling me when he'd be back." "Do you remember if he was wearing a coat when he left?" Power asked. "Let's see. In the morning he had a tweed topcoat. He's a sharp dresser, and I always notice what he's wearing. When he went out Monday afternoon, he was wearing the tweed topcoat, but when he came back, he had on his Burberry. I hadn't thought of it before, but I guess he must have gone home." Susan reached the studio with 10 minutes to spare. As usual, she poked her head into Jed Geeney's office, already prepared for his reminder that one of these days she wasn't going to get there by broadcast time. But today, when he looked up at her, his face was grim. "I'm beginning to think we jinx our callers, Susan." "What's that supposed to mean?" "You haven't heard? Tiffany, the waitress at the restaurant in Yonkers, was stabbed to death last night when she was leaving work." "She was what?" Susan felt as if she had been punched. She clutched the side of Jed's desk to steady herself. "Easy, take it easy," he cautioned, standing. "You've got a program to do in a couple of minutes. You also have to be prepared for the fact that a lot of listeners probably will phone in about her. Somehow Susan managed to get through the program. As Jed had predicted, the lines were flooded with calls about Tiffany. As she was winding up the program for the day, Susan told her listeners, "Please, all of you remember Tiffany and her family in your prayers. Our time is up. I'll be back with you tomorrow." Susan was deep in thought as she headed over to her office. "The element connecting everything here is the turquoise ring," she told herself. Regina Clausen had one and is dead. Carolyn Wells had one and may die. Tiffany had one and is dead. Pamela Hastings, an intelligent woman who says she has the powers of precognition, wouldn't touch Regina's ring, and only a few days before had warned Carolyn Wells that hers could be the cause of her death. Tiffany told me last night that her ring was buried under tons of chicken bones and pizza. That sounds like a garbage pail. But tons? Did she mean in a dumpster? And if she did, what more likely dumpster than one on the site of the Grotto restaurant? Susan's mind was racing. How often would the Grotto's dumpster normally be emptied? As soon as she reached her office, she made some quick calls and found out that the Yonkers police had impounded the Grotto's dumpster looking for the murder weapon. She begged them to sift the dumpster not only for the murder weapon, but also for a turquoise ring with the inscription, "You belong to me," inside the band. Dr. Donald Richards telephoned Susan around 4 that afternoon, having heard of Tiffany's murder. "Don, I have a question. Do you think Justin Wells pushed his wife in front of that man?" "No, I do not," Richards told her. "I think it's much more likely that it was an accident. I went to see Captain Shea today and told him as much. True, Wells is obsessed about his wife, but part of that obsession is an extreme fear of losing her. In my opinion, he would never hurt her deliberately." "Then you think that Hilda Johnson, the witness who said she saw someone push Carolyn Wells, was wrong?" "Not necessarily. You can't rule out the possibility that if Justin Wells followed Carolyn and wanted to see what she had in that envelope, he might inadvertently have caused her to lose her balance. Don't forget that when Karen, or Carolyn, phoned you, she promised to give you a picture of the man she had met on the cruise. Doesn't it seem likely it might have been in that envelope?" "Does Captain Shea agree with your theory?" "Well, that's hard to say, but I did warn him that if someone else pushed Carolyn Wells, whether by accident or by design, and Justin Wells learns who he is, his anger will be such that Wells may be capable of anything, including murder." Justin Wells agreed to meet Susan at his apartment with Pamela Hastings, but only after Susan had explained to him that she was convinced he had nothing to do with his wife's accident. When Justin opened the door, she found herself looking into the troubled eyes of an attractive man in his early 40s. Dark hair, broad shoulders, athletic build. He was downright good-looking, she decided as she studied him. She extended her hand to him and introduced herself. "Come in, Dr. Chandler." "It's Susan, not Dr. Chandler," she said. Susan greeted Pamela Hastings warmly, then got right to the point. "When Carolyn phoned me on Monday, she said she would come to my office and bring with her a turquoise ring and a picture of the man who gave it to her. We know now that she may have changed her mind and decided to mail those things to me instead. What I hope is that there are perhaps other things, souvenirs or whatever, that she kept from her cruise that would give us some indication of the mystery man she mentioned." "Doctor," Wells said, "you're welcome to look for anything here that will help us find the person who did this to Carolyn." "Thank you," Susan said. "Let's get started." Carolyn Wells kept an office in the apartment, a large room complete with a spacious desk, a couch, a drafting board, and files. Pamela Hastings put her hand on Justin's arm. "Justin, why don't you wait for us in the living room?" she suggested. "You don't need this." "You're right, I don't." When he turned to go down the hall, Susan turned to Pamela. "Let's get started," she said. Susan went through the desk, while Pamela rifled through the file drawers. She realized she felt very much a voyeur, going through the personal papers of a woman she never had met. "Wait a minute," Pamela called. "This may be it." She carried a file to the desk and pulled up a chair. "Let's hope," Susan murmured as they both began to go through it. But the file seemed useless. It contained only the sort of information people save as mementos of trips, things like the itinerary, daily bulletins listing the activities of the day, and information about the approaching ports of call. "Mumbai, that's the new or at least the old and restored name of Bombay," Pamela said. "Carolyn boarded the ship there. Oman, Haifa, Alexandria, Athens, Tangier, Lisbon, those were her ports of call." "Algiers is where Carolyn almost got off the ship with a mystery man," Susan said. "Look at the date. The ship was scheduled to stop there on October 15th. That's exactly 2 years ago next week." "She arrived home on the 20th, Pamela Hastings observed. "I remember because it was my husband's birthday." Susan glanced through the bulletins. The last one described possible excursions from the ship. The headline was, "See the marketplace in Old Algiers." "That's a line in the song You Belong to Me," she thought. Then she noticed that there was something written lightly in pencil on the last page. She bent down to examine it closely. It read, "Wynn, Palace Hotel, 555-0634. She showed it to Pamela. "I think we can be sure that Wynn is the man she was meeting," she said quietly. "Dear God, do you think that means she is calling for him now?" Pamela asked. "I don't know. If only the picture she promised to give me was still here," Susan said. Her eyes swept the desk as though expecting the photograph to materialize. Then she noticed a sliver of bright blue cardboard next to a small pair of scissors. Susan reached under the desk for the wastebasket. Retrieving it, she dumped its contents on the rug. Bits of blue cardboard scattered, and a photograph with an uneven border fell out. Susan picked it up and studied it. "This is Carolyn with the ship's captain, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," Pamela said. "But why did she cut it like that?" "My guess is Carolyn wanted to send only the part of the photograph that pictured the man who gave her the turquoise ring. She didn't want to be involved or identified herself." "And now it's gone," Pamela said. "It may be gone," Susan told her as she put together the scraps of cardboard. "But look at this. The name of the outfit in London that takes those pictures is printed on the folder, and there are instructions for ordering additional copies." She pushed back the chair and stood up. "I'm going to call that outfit, and if they still have the negative of this photograph, I'm going to get it." "Pamela, do you realize that if that's possible, we may be on our way to learning the identity of a serial killer?" Donald Richards had told his housekeeper that he had dinner plans, then, not wanting to dine alone, had on impulse phoned Mark Greenberg, a good friend and fellow psychiatrist, whom he had seen professionally for a while after his wife's death. By lucky chance, Greenberg was free for dinner. They met at Kennedy's on West 57th Street. "Don, we haven't talked doctor to patient in a long time. How's it going?" Richards smiled. "I'm restless. I guess that's a good sign." "Still blame yourself for Kathy's death?" Greenberg asked quietly. "I'd like to believe I'm starting to get over that, but sometimes it still hits me hard. Mark, you've heard it from me enough times. Kathy didn't want to do that shoot. She was feeling queasy. But I got on her about her habit of canceling plans at the last minute, especially when it came to work commitments, so she went. Well, listening to me cost her her life." Don Richards took a long sip of his drink. "There's still rough times, Mark, but it's getting better. Maybe turning 40 soon is making me realize that it's time to let go of the past." "Have you considered taking a cruise, even a short one? I think that's an important step for you to take." "Actually, I'm hoping to take one soon. I wrap up the publicity for the book next week in Miami, and I'm looking to see if I can find a cruise that I can fit in." That's good news, Greenberg said. Last question. Are you dating anyone? I had a date last night. Susan Chandler, a psychologist. She has a daily radio program as well as a private practice. Very attractive and interesting lady. Then I gather you plan to see her again. Don Richards smiled. I'd say I have big plans for her, Mark. When Don Richards got home at 10 o'clock, he debated calling Susan, then decided it wasn't too late to try. I'm glad you called, Don. I wanted to ask you something. Go ahead. You used to take a lot of cruises, right? Yes, both before I was married and after. My wife and I both loved the sea. And you were on the Gabrielle a number of times? Yes. Well, by any chance, do you have any pictures that might have been taken on the Gabrielle? What I'm hoping to learn is the name of the photography outfit that works or worked the Gabrielle. I'm sure I have some pictures from when Kathy and I were on cruises. Hold on. He pulled down a box from the top shelf of the closet that was marked Vacations and brought it back to the phone. He soon came across what he was looking for, a pile of bright blue cardboard folders. He opened the one on top and looked at a picture of Kathy and himself at their table on the Gabrielle. He removed the picture from the folder and turned it over. On the back was information about reorders. His voice was steady as he read it to Susan. Oh, that's a real break, Susan said. The same company handled the pictures on both the Gabrielle and the ship Carolyn sailed on, the Sea Godiva. I might be able to get a copy of the picture we think Carolyn Wells was going to mail to me. After a good night's sleep, Susan phoned Ocean Cruise Pictures Ltd. in London and explained what she needed. The picture I want on the Sea Godiva shows a single woman with the captain. Could you possibly go through those negatives and make a copy of all the pictures taken of a single woman posing with the captain? On the leg from Mumbai to Athens in October 2 years ago, said the employee. That's right. We would, of course, need to be paid in advance. Oh, of course, if the money is wired today, can you send the pictures by courier tonight? Certainly by tomorrow, Doctor. You'll have them by Monday. You do realize we may be talking about as many as 400 prints. Yes, just let me know the cost, and I'll wire you the money immediately. On Friday morning, Chris Ryan, the former FBI agent Susan had hired, settled back in his swivel chair and began to study the preliminary feedback he had gotten from his sources about Douglas Layton. The initial piece of information checked out. Layton's educational background was exactly what he claimed it to be. The next item, however, was a clear indication to Chris that there was something funny about Layton. He'd had 4 different jobs since graduating from law school, and even though he seemed to have all the attributes that would guarantee he would make partner, it never had happened. As he studied the report, one significant point stood out. For someone who was paid to both preserve and spend impressive sums of money, Layton seemed to have precious little of his own. What gives? Chris muttered to himself. Here's a guy in his mid-30s, single with no apparent financial responsibilities, he thought. He has worked with good companies for good bucks, yet it looks like he's worth nothing. His car is leased, his apartment's a rental, checking account deposits just about cover monthly expenses. There's no record of a savings account. So what does Layton do with his money? He could have a drug habit, of course, and if he does, chances are, like most addicts, he's finding a way to support it, and he's probably not relying just on his salary. Chris smiled grimly. There was definitely enough here to justify a more probing investigation. When Susan arrived at her office, there was a call from the Yonkers police on the answering machine. She listened with a sense of triumph to the news that they had found the ring in the dumpster at the grotto. This could be important, she thought. She called Captain Pete Gonzalez of the Yonkers Police Department right back. Have you got the ring there? Right here. Any inscription on the inside? Oh, yeah. Hard to read, though. Okay, it says, You belong to me." "Pete, let's do it this way," Susan begged. "Please treat the ring as evidence and have your lab make enlarged photographs of it from every angle and fax them to me." Susan had barely replaced the receiver before Janet announced a call from Chris Ryan, who filled her in on what he had learned so far about Douglas Layton. He concluded his observations by saying, "Susie, we're hot on the scene." "Yes, we are," Susan thought, "and in more ways than you know." She asked Chris to keep her posted, then alerted Janet to be on the lookout for the faxes from Yonkers. The faxes arrived around lunchtime. Susan sat at her desk and laid out the faxes of the enlarged photos and compared them with the ring Jane Clausen had given her. The photographer had even managed to get some excellent shots of the inscription on the inside of the band. As Susan had expected, there were remarkable similarities. "I'm right," she thought. "This is all about the rings. The one Mrs. Clausen gave me simply has to have been made by the same guy who made Tiffany's, which means it almost certainly was bought at the souvenir shop in the village that Tiffany told me about. I'd stake my life that Tiffany was murdered because someone heard her when she talked to me on the air about a man she had seen buying one of these rings, and he was afraid she could identify him." Susan's lunch arrived from the deli. Janet brought it in and placed it on her desk. When Susan put down the turquoise ring, Janet picked it up and examined it. "What a nice sentiment," she said as she read the inscription. "My mother loves old songs, and you belong to me as one of her favorites." She began to sing. "See the pyramids along the Nile, watch the sunrise on a tropic isle. Dee 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 dee." Then there's something about a marketplace in old Algiers, and then something else about photographs and souvenirs. I don't remember how that part goes, but it's a really nice song. "Yes, it is," Susan agreed absent-mindedly. Almost like an alarm she couldn't shut off, the words of the song were sounding in her head. But what is it about them? She wondered. She took the ring back and tucked it in her wallet. By late Friday afternoon, Chris Ryan had managed to find both concrete facts and abundant rumors about Douglas Layton. The facts were that he was a compulsive gambler who was semi-notorious in Atlantic City, and it was widely known that on at least a half a dozen occasions he had lost a great deal of money. And that explains why he doesn't have a nickel to his name, Chris thought. One rumor was that Layton had been barred from ever traveling on several of the cruise lines because of his suspected cheating at their gaming tables. Another rumor was that he had been asked to resign from jobs at 2 investment firms because of complaints that he frequently displayed a condescending attitude toward female employees. On Friday, page 6 of the Post reported that architect Justin Wells was being questioned about his wife's accident, and the article included a picture of him leaving the hospital. All morning, Oliver Baker kept the Post on his desk at work, with the paper open to the article. Then shortly before noon, he had phoned Captain Shea to say that he would like to see him after work. That was why, at 5:30 Friday afternoon, Oliver Baker was back in Captain Shea's office, the picture from the newspaper in hand. "Captain, the more I look at this man's picture, the more positive I am that he was the one I saw take that envelope as he tried to steady the woman who fell in front of the van." Susan took the subway to West 4th Street and 6th Avenue. Her plan was to move out from the subway station along the haphazard streets of the village until she found a souvenir store featuring Indian goods that was located across the street from a pawn shop. It sounded simple enough. How many could there be? She had decided that if she found the shop, she would go in and try to get friendly with the Indian clerk. Then, once she had the cruise picture of Carolyn Wells that showed the man who had given her the turquoise ring, she would ask the clerk if he recognized him. She wasn't there yet, but she was narrowing the circle around the killer. She could feel it. Unlike the grid in which the streets of uptown Manhattan had been laid out, the streets of the village followed an irregular pattern all their own. Finally, Susan gave up, bought the Post, and dropped into Tutta Pasta on Carmine Street for a late dinner. "I didn't find the place tonight," she told herself, "but I'll be back looking first thing in the morning." Despite, or perhaps because of, the exhaustion she had felt earlier, Susan was unable to sleep well. 3 different times during the night she woke up and found herself listening intently for any sound that might suggest someone was in the apartment. The first time she woke, she thought she had heard the outer door opening. The sensation was so vivid that she got up and ran to the door, only to find that it was bolted. She returned to her bedroom, still haunted by the sensation that something was amiss. The temperature had dropped sharply when she went to bed, and the room was almost icy cold. She pulled the blankets around her neck, recalling the dream that had made her so uneasy and finally awakened her. In it, she had seen Tiffany running out of a door and into a dimly lighted space. She had the turquoise ring and was tossing it in the air. Then a hand appeared out of the shadows and grabbed the ring, and Tiffany cried out, "No, don't take it, I want to keep it." Then her eyes widened in terror and she screamed. Susan shivered. "And now Tiffany is dead because she called me," she thought. "Oh, God, I'm so sorry." The second time Susan awoke, she bolted up in bed, sure there had been someone at the window. She awoke for the 3rd time at 6 o'clock. Although she had been sleeping, her mind had been alive, and she realized that sometime in between the interruptions in her sleep, her subconscious had been dwelling on the passenger list from the Sea Godiva. She had found it in Carolyn Wells' file, and Justin Wells had allowed her to take it. When she awoke, her mind had focused on the fact that Carolyn had written the name Wynne on one of the daily news bulletins from the ship. Wynne was almost certainly the man she had been planning to go to Algiers with, Susan thought. I should have studied the passenger list right away. We know the guy she met was a passenger on the ship, so that means his name has to be on the list. Awake now, with no hope of going back to sleep, she decided that coffee would help to clear her brain. She brought a cup back to bed, propped herself up with pillows, and began to study the ship's manifest. Wynne must be short for something else, she decided. Running down the list of passenger names, she looked for a Winston or Winthrop, but no one with either of those names was found as being on board. It could be a nickname, she thought. There were passengers with last names that were possibilities, but both were listed as being with wives. Susan went down the manifest, checking off the names of men who were listed without a woman's name. The first name on the manifest that appeared to be that of a single man was Mr. Owen Adams. Interesting, she thought when she had finished running down the entire list of passengers. Of 600 people on the ship, only 16 men apparently were traveling alone. That narrowed it down a lot. Then another thought struck her. Would the manifest of the Gabrielle be among Regina Clausen's effects? And if so, was it possible that one of those 16 men from the Sea Godiva had been a passenger on that ship too? Susan tossed back the covers and headed to the shower. Even if Mrs. Clausen isn't up to seeing me, I'm going to ask her about the Gabrielle's passenger list, she decided, and if it was returned with Regina's things, I'll beg her to give it to me. He wished there was some way he could accelerate his plan, but it was too late. The steps had been laid out, and it couldn't be changed now. He would leave on schedule, but then he would double back, and that's when he would eliminate her. He would not follow her and try to force her into traffic as he had with Carolyn Wells, for while Carolyn remained in a coma, she was still a threat. No, he would have to corner Susan alone, as he had Tiffany. That would be best. Although there might be another way, he thought suddenly. This afternoon, in the guise of a messenger, he would check out her office building, studying the security in the lobby and the layout of the floor on which her office was located. It was Saturday, so it wouldn't be crowded. There would be fewer curious eyes to observe him. The thought of killing Susan in her office was eminently satisfying. He had decided that he would honor her with the same form of death that he had accorded Veronica, Regina, Constance, and Monica, the same death that was awaiting his final victim, someone on a voyage to see the jungle wet with rain. He would overpower her, tie her up and gag her, and then, as she watched, tortured with fear, he would slowly unwrap the long plastic bag, and inch by agonizing inch, he would cover her with it. Once she was covered head to toe, he would seal the bag. Inevitably, there would be a little air still inside, just enough so that she would have a few minutes to struggle. Then, as he saw the plastic begin to stick to her face and seal her mouth and nostrils, he would leave. However, he would not be able to dispose of Susan's body as he had the others. The others he had either buried in sand or weighed down with stones and watched disappear into murky waters. So Susan Chandler he would have to leave, but he could take comfort in the fact that after she was out of the way, the next and final victim would share the burial arrangements of her sisters in death. Susan left her apartment at 9 o'clock and walked directly to 7th Avenue. From there she explored the blocks in Greenwich Village that slanted west towards the Hudson River. Most of these streets were largely residential, although she did find several souvenir shops. In none of them, however, did she see a sign of Indian-style objects. She decided to continue her search by exploring the area just east of 6th Avenue and turned onto McDougal Street. The first thing she saw was the porn shop, with its oval-shaped sign that read, Dark Delights. She spun around. Across the street she saw a for rent sign in the window of the Cayenne specialty shop. Oh no, she thought. Threading her way through traffic, she crossed the narrow street to the shop, stood at the door, and peered inside. Even though the shop seemed to be fully stocked, the interior had a deserted look. Where was the proprietor or clerk? She rushed back across the street to the pawn shop. The door was open, and the place seemed to be doing a brisk business. There appeared to be only one clerk, a thin, unattractive man who, like his surroundings, seemed a little seedy. She pointed at the Cayenne specialty shop across the street. "When did that store close?" she asked. "Lady, you haven't heard what happened? Abdul Parki, the guy who owned that place, was murdered Tuesday afternoon." Murdered? Another one, she thought, another one. Tiffany talked about the shop's owner on my program. "Did you know Parki?" the man asked. "He was a sweet little guy." She shook her head while struggling to compose herself. "A friend of mine recommended his shop," she said. "Someone gave her one of the turquoise rings he made. Look." She opened her bag and pulled out the ring Jane Clausen had given her. The man glanced at the ring and then at her. "Yeah, that's one of Parky's rings, all right. He was nuts about turquoise. Oh, by the way, I'm Nat Small. I own this place." "I'm Susan Chandler." Susan held out her hand. "I can tell he was a good friend of yours," she said. "How did it happen?" "Stabbed. The cops think it was druggies, although they didn't take nothing so far as anyone can tell." "Were there any witnesses?" Small shook his head and looked away as he spoke. "Nobody's seen nothing." "Actually, the young woman who told me about Parky was stabbed to death on Wednesday night. I think the person who killed both her and Parky is a customer who bought several of these turquoise rings from him over the past 3 or 4 years. Nat Small's sallow complexion turned a deeper gray as he met Susan's gaze. "Parky told me about that guy. Said he was a real gentleman." Small shook his head. "Nothing more than that." "I think you know something you haven't told me, Nat." "You're wrong." His eyes shifted toward the door. Look, I don't mind talking with you, but you're scaring away my customers. There's a guy hanging around outside, and I know he won't come in while you're here." Susan looked the little man directly in the eyes. "Nat, I sense that you know something you're not telling me. You've got to tell me before someone else dies." "I don't want to get involved," he said. "Nat, if you know anything, you're already involved. Please tell me, what is it?" His voice was almost a whisper now. "Well, just before 1 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, a guy was kind of hanging around, looking in the window. I figured he was trying to pick out something he wanted, or maybe even he was nervous about coming in here. He looked like a real uptown guy. But then he went across the street and into Parky's shop. After that, a customer came in here and I didn't pay attention anymore." "Did you report what you saw to the police?" "That's just what I didn't do. The police have me going through mug books or describing him for a sketch artist, but it would be just a waste. He was not the kind to be in mug books, and I'm no good telling people how to draw. I saw the guy in profile. He was classy looking, in his late 30s. He had a cap on and a raincoat and sunglasses, but I still got a real good look at his profile." "You think you'd recognize him if you saw him again?" "Lady, in this business I gotta recognize people. If I don't remember what the undercover cops look like, I might get busted. And if I can't spot a druggie, I might get murdered. Listen, you gotta get out of here. You're bad for business. The guys don't want to come in with a classy-looking dame hanging around." "Okay, I'll go. But Nat, tell me, would you recognize this man if I could show you his picture?" "Yeah, I would. Now, will you get out of here?" "Right away. Oh, and one more thing, Nat. Don't talk about this, not to anybody. For your own safety, don't talk about it." From the village, Susan took a cab uptown to visit Jane Clausen, who had been admitted to the hospital for chemotherapy. She found her room, then tapped on the door and looked in. "Oh, Mrs. Clausen, I didn't know you had company." "Come in, Susan. You remember Douglas Layton, don't you? You met last Monday in your office." Susan thought of what Chris Ryan had told her about Layton. "Yes, I do remember," she said coolly. "How are you, Mr. Layton?" "Very well, Dr. Chandler." She knows something, Layton thought. I'd better stick around. She wouldn't dare say anything about me while I'm here. He held out a chair for Susan. She had hoped he would leave, but he pulled up another chair, signaling his intention to continue his visit. "Douglas, I won't keep you," Jane Clausen told him. "I need to have a few words with Susan, and then I'm afraid I'll have to rest." "Of course." He sprang up, his expression and manner solicitous. There was another tap on the door, and a nurse put her head in the room. "Mrs. Clausen, the doctor will be here to see you in just a minute." "Oh, dear, Susan," Mrs. Clausen said. "I'm afraid you've come here for nothing. Will you call me in the morning?" "Of course." As she got up to leave, Susan noticed a bright blue folder on the nightstand next to the bed. It appeared to be identical to the one she had found pieces of in the wastebasket in Carolyn Wells' home office. She walked over and picked it up. As she had expected, the front of the folder displayed the logo of Ocean Cruise Pictures. She looked at Mrs. Clausen. "May I?" "Absolutely. That was probably the last picture ever taken of Regina." There was no mistaking that the woman in the picture was Jane Clausen's daughter. Regina was posed, standing next to the Gabrielle's captain. The obligatory cruise photo, Susan thought, but it's a very good one. "From the date on the folder, I know that photograph was made 2 days before Regina disappeared," Jane Clausen said. "I'm sorry I have to interrupt." The doctor was standing in the doorway. Clearly he expected them to leave. Susan could not wait any longer for Layton to depart. "Mrs. Clausen," she said hurriedly, "do you remember if a passenger list from the cruise ship was among the things found in Regina's stateroom?" "I'm sure I saw one in the envelope with other information about the cruise. Why, Susan?" "Because if I may, I would very much like to borrow it for a few days. Could I pick it up tomorrow?" "Oh, no, if it's important, you better get it now. Douglas, hand me my purse, please. It's in the drawer of the night table." She took out her wallet and pulled a card from inside. After jotting a note on it, she handed it to Susan. "My housekeeper, Vera, is there still, and I'll phone her to let her know you're coming. But you can take this note just in case. It has my address. We'll talk tomorrow." Douglas Layton left with Susan. Together they went down in the elevator and out to the street. "I'd be happy to go with you," he suggested. "No, that's fine. Here's a cab. I'll grab it." Susan found the passenger list right away inside a manila envelope in the top drawer of an antique desk in Regina's room. The folder was marked, "Papers found in Regina's stateroom." Inside were the kinds of memorabilia that Carolyn Wells had brought back from her cruise. In addition to the passenger list, there were copies of the daily shipboard news bulletins with information about the upcoming ports of call and a variety of postcards that seemed to be from those ports. Susan put the passenger list in her shoulder bag, then decided to take a quick look through the postcards and bulletins. She flipped through the postcards, stopping when she noticed one from Bali that featured an outdoor restaurant. A table overlooking the ocean had been neatly circled in pen. Did she dine there? Susan wondered. And if she did, why was it special? She skimmed through the newsletters until she found the one about Bali. She took the passenger list, postcard, and newsletter along with her. It was 6:10 before she opened the door of her apartment. 40 minutes to get ready for the big date with Alex Wright, she thought, and I haven't even decided what to wear. Although she had been inside the huge Fifth Avenue branch of the New York Public Library many times, Susan didn't remember ever seeing the McGraw Rotunda where the party was taking place. It was a magnificent space. With its soaring stone walls and life-size murals, it made her feel as though she had been transported back in time to another century. Susan wore a black tuxedo jacket with a long, narrow skirt. Despite the elegant setting, and despite the fact that she really was enjoying Alex Wright's company, an hour later Susan found herself distracted and unable to relax. I should be enjoying a very pleasant evening, she thought. And here I am, preoccupied with thoughts of a very questionable man who runs a porn shop and who may be able to identify the murderer of Regina Clausen, Hilda Johnson, Tiffany Smith, and Abdul Parki, the man who attempted to murder Carolyn Wells. 4 of those names had been added to the list during the last week. Were there others? Would there be others? Why was she so sure that the answer was yes? Dee and her father and Binky came in minutes after she and Alex arrived. Dee, exquisite in a white sheath, had hugged her warmly. "Susie, have you heard? I'm moving back, lock, stock, and barrel. We'll have fun. I've missed not having you around." I actually believe she means it, Susan thought. That's why what she's been trying to pull with Alex is so unfair. Throughout dinner, Susan once again found herself distracted so that she didn't notice what she was eating. Her sense of foreboding was so strong as to seem like a physical presence. After the main course had been cleared, the director of the library spoke about the generosity of the Wright Family Foundation and about the grant to purchase and maintain rare books. He spoke also of the modesty and dedication of Alexander Carter Wright, who so unselfishly devotes his life to running the foundation and who shuns personal recognition. "See what a nice guy I am?" Alex whispered to Susan as he stood up to accept the award the directors were presenting. Alex was a good speaker, his manner easy, gracious, and laced with a touch of humor. When he was seated again, Susan murmured, "Alex, do you mind if I switch places with Dee for dessert?" "Susan, is anything wrong?" "No, not at all. Peace in the family and all that. I can see that Dee is unhappy, having her ear bent by that guy next to her. Maybe if I rescue her, we'll bond a little." Alex's amused chuckle followed her as she walked to the nearby table and asked Dee to trade places. She then wandered off on her own for a few minutes to think. "I know Nat Small may be at risk," she thought, "and he may not be the only one. There could be another person marked to receive one of the turquoise rings with 'You belong to me' engraved inside the band. Why did the lyrics of that song keep running through her head? Now she was hearing, 'Watch the sunrise on a tropic isle.' Of course! Those words had been on the bulletin from the Gabrielle that she had found among Regina Clausen's effects earlier in the day. "I'll have the pictures from the Sigadiva on Monday," Susan thought. "That means by Monday night I should have found Carolyn's picture. If the studio can make copies of the photographs from the Gabrielle by Tuesday afternoon, I'll have them Wednesday. I'll spend as much time as necessary going through them, even if I have to stay up all night." Susan had asked Pamela Hastings to keep her up to date on how Carolyn was progressing. When she got home from the library dinner Saturday night, There was a message from Pamela. Carolyn's trying to talk again, but all she said was the usual, "Win, oh, win." As she got ready for bed, Susan let the words roll off her tongue. Win, oh, win, win, oh, win, oh, win, Owen, Susan thought. Oh my God, that's what Carolyn is saying. Not Owen, but Owen. She remembered there was an Owen Adams on the passenger list of the Sea Godiva. He was the first man she had checked off as traveling without a wife. She ran to her desk and grabbed the passenger list from the Gabrielle. Be here, she thought, be here. There was no Owen Adams listed, something she was able to determine almost immediately, but realizing the man she was looking for might very well travel under a false name, she continued searching through the passenger list. She was almost at the end when she found it. One of the very few passengers whose middle name appeared on the list was Henry Owen Young. There must be a connection, she thought. First thing Monday morning, Susan called Chris Ryan. Chris, I'm onto something and I need you to check out 2 people for me. One was a passenger on a cruise ship, the Gabrielle, 3 years ago. The second one was on another cruise ship, the Sea Godiva, 2 years ago. The thing is, I don't think they're different people at all. I think they may be one and the same person, and if I'm right, we're talking about a serial killer. Give me the names and dates, Chris said. When he heard them, he commented, both mid-October. Do cruise ships give a discount then? The dates have been in the back of my mind, Chris. If mid-October is part of a pattern, then some woman could be in terrible danger right now. Let me get on it with Quantico, Chris said. My guys at the FBI can do a fast track. Oh, Susan, it turns out your pal, Doug Layton, may be in trouble. He lost big time at the tables in Atlantic City last week. What do you mean by big time? Try $400,000. I hope he's got a rich aunt. The trouble is that he thinks he does. Thanks, Chris. We'll be talking. She hung up the phone and looked at her watch. She would have enough time to visit briefly with Mrs. Clausen before she went to the studio. She's got to know about Layton immediately, Susan thought. If he owes that much money to gamblers, he'll need to cover it right away, and the Clausen Family Trust is where he'll go for it. Jane Clausen knew something was seriously wrong when Susan phoned and requested such an early morning visit. She had also heard the tension in Douglas Layton's voice when he called a few minutes later to say he needed to stop by on his way to the airport. He was leaving for Guatemala to check on the construction of the orphanage, and one more trust document required her signature. As soon as Susan arrived, she told Jane Clausen everything she had learned about Layton. Mrs. Clausen immediately put a call through to Hubert March. Hubert, get down to the office, call in your auditors, and make sure that Douglas Layton can't get his hands on any of our bank accounts or liquidate any of our assets, and do it now. Susan finished her radio broadcast and went back to the office. When Janet brought Susan her lunch, she was humming You Belong to Me. Dr. Chandler, that song has been going through my head all weekend. I just can't shake it. It was driving me crazy because I couldn't remember all the lyrics, so I phoned my mother and she sang them to me. It's really a pretty song. Yes, it is, Susan agreed absent-mindedly. See the pyramids along the Nile. Watch the sunrise on a tropic isle. Unasked, Janet was singing the lyrics of You Belong to Me. See the marketplace in old Algiers. Suddenly, Susan held up her hand. Stop for a minute, Janet. Janet looked embarrassed. I'm sorry if my singing is bothering you, Doctor. No, you're not bothering me at all. It's just that while listening to you, something occurred to me about that song. Susan thought of the news bulletin from the Gabrielle that had referred to Bali as a tropic isle, and the postcard of a restaurant in Bali with a circle drawn around a table on the dining veranda. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Susan could sense that the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, though she still hadn't figured out who had been manipulating them. Wynne, or Owen, wanted to show Carolyn Wells around Algiers, she thought. See the marketplace in old Algiers. Janet, could you sing the rest of the lyrics, please, now? If you want, Doctor. Let's see. Fly the ocean in a silver plane. 3 years ago, Regina disappeared after being in Bali, Susan thought. 2 years ago, it could have been Carolyn, and there may have been someone else chosen in her stead, in Algiers. Last year, he may have met a woman on a plane rather than a cruise ship. What could have been before that, she asked herself. Let's go back. Did he meet a woman 4 years ago in Egypt? That would fit the pattern, she decided. See the jungle when it's wet with rain. That could be the lyric for this year's victim, Susan thought. Somebody who has no idea she's being staked out for death. Just remember till you're home again, you belong to me. Susan put a call into Chris Ryan. Chris, will you see if you can track something else down? I need to know if there are any reports of a woman, probably a tourist, who vanished in Egypt in mid-October 4 years ago. That shouldn't be too hard. I was just about to call you anyway. You remember those names you gave me this morning? Of those passengers on the 2 cruise ships? What about them? Those guys don't exist. The passports they used were fakes. I knew it, Susan thought. I knew it. At 10:05 that afternoon, Susan took an urgent phone call from Chris Ryan. You're pushing the right button, Susan. 4 years ago, a 39-year-old widow from Birmingham, Alabama, disappeared while in Egypt. She was on a cruise to the Middle East. She apparently had skipped the regular land tour and gone off by herself. Her body was never found. Late that afternoon, a bulky package was delivered. The sender was Ocean Cruise Pictures Ltd. of London. Susan's day was filled with appointments, and she wouldn't be finished with her last patient until 7. Then she finally would be able to go through the photographs that might just reveal the face of the man who had killed Regina Clausen and so many others. Monday was a day of departures. Alex was going to Russia for a week, Dee left for a cruise to Costa Rica, and Donald flew to Florida for a final week of promotions for his book. He then planned to take a week off. Perhaps he'd take a cruise, he thought. When Dee arrived in Costa Rica, she went directly to the harbor where her cruise ship, the Valerie, had just docked. When she got to her stateroom, she found a vase holding 24 pale gold roses. She quickly read the card. It was signed, Guess Who. Dee cupped the card in her hand. She didn't have to guess. She knew who had sent them. At the dinner Saturday night, when she had changed places with Susan, Alex Wright had said to her, I'm glad Susan suggested you sit next to me. I can't abide seeing a beautiful woman be lonely. I guess I'm more like my father than I realized. My stepmother was beautiful like you, and also a lonely widow when my father met her on a cruise ship. He solved her loneliness by marrying her. Dee remembered that she had joked that it seemed a little radical to marry someone just to cure her loneliness, and Alex had taken her hand and said, Perhaps, but not as radical as some solutions. It's Jack all over again, she thought as she inhaled the scent of the roses. I didn't want to hurt Susan then, and I certainly don't want to hurt her now. But I don't think she's really that interested in Alex yet. I'm sure she'll understand. Dee showered, washed her hair, and dressed for dinner, imagining what fun it would be if instead of going to Russia, Alex were a passenger on the ship with her. Susan's last patient left around 7 p.m. She eagerly carried the box of pictures to her office. Only the ones from Carolyn's ship were here, about 400. A note accompanying them said that over 1,000 pictures taken on the Gabrielle would be arriving tomorrow. As she set the box on her desk, she accidentally hit the beautiful Waterford vase Alex Wright had given her, sending it crashing to the floor. What a shame, she thought, as she swept up the shards of glass and loaded them into the wastebasket. What will he look like, she wondered, as she began searching the photos. She was aware that there was very little likelihood she would recognize him. I just pray the photo was clear enough to give the police something to go on, she thought. An hour later, she was still going through the photographs, still searching for the one with Carolyn Wells. It has to be here, Susan thought. They said they were going to send every print they had of a woman posing with the captain. Oh, where in God's name is it? She asked out loud. Why, of all of them, is that one missing? Because I have it, Susan, a familiar voice said in response. Susan spun around in time to receive the blow of a paperweight smashing against the side of her head. Just as he had planned, he would follow the same procedure with Susan Chandler that he had used for all the others. He would bind her arms and hands to her sides, bind her legs together, truss her so that as she woke up and realized what was happening, she would be able to squirm a little, just enough to give her hope, but not enough to save her. While he twisted the rope around her limp body, he explained to her why it was happening. You must understand, Susan, he began in a reasoning tone of voice. I never would have harmed you if only you hadn't butted in. In fact, I quite like you. I do, sincerely. You're an interesting woman and very smart, too. But then that's been your undoing, hasn't it? Perhaps you're too smart for your own good. He began to wind the rope around her arms, lifting her body gently. She was lying on the floor beside her desk. He had found a pillow and placed it under her head. He had dimmed the overhead lights. Why did you have to talk about Regina Clausen on your radio program, Susan? You should have left it alone. She's been dead 3 years. Her body's at the bottom of Kowloon Bay. She liked it there. It's very picturesque. He crossed and crisscrossed the rope over her upper body. Hong Kong is Regina's final resting place, but it was in Bali that she fell in love with me. For such a smart woman, it was remarkably easy to convince her to leave the ship. But that's what happens when you're lonely. You want to fall in love, so you're anxious to believe someone who pays attention to you. He began to tie Susan's legs. My father was really duped as well, Susan. He and my mother were a grim, humorless pair, but he missed her when she died. My father was wealthy, but my mother had a lot of money of her own. In her will, she left it all to him, but she thought he'd eventually pass it on to me. Susan was aware of a familiar voice just above her, but her head was splitting with pain, and she didn't dare open her eyes. What is happening to me? She wondered. Alex Wright was here, but who hit me? She had gotten just a glimpse of him before she blacked out. He had untidy, longish hair and was wearing a cap and a shabby sweatsuit. Wait, she thought, making herself focus. The voice is Alex's. That means he's still here. Then, what she had been hearing sank in, and she opened her eyes. His face was only inches away from hers. His eyes were glittering, shining with the kind of madness she had seen in the eyes of patients in locked wards. He's mad, she thought. She could see now. It was Alex in that straggly wig, Alex in those shabby clothes, Alex whose eyes were like sharp chips of turquoise slicing deeply into her. I have your shroud, Susan. It's exactly the same as the ones the others wore. He stood, and she could see that he was holding up a long plastic bag. much like the kind used to protect expensive gowns. "Oh, God," she thought, "he's going to suffocate me." "I do this slowly, Susan. It's my favorite part. I want you to anticipate the moment when the air is cut off and the final struggle begins." He knelt in front of her and lifted her feet, sliding the plastic bag underneath her so that her feet and legs were inside. She tried to kick it away, but her struggles had no effect, not even slowing him as he continued to slide the plastic bag up her body. Finally, when he reached her neck, he paused. "You see, soon after my mother died, my father took a cruise. On it, he met a lonely widow, or so she claimed. She was very girlish, not at all like my mother. She was 35 years my father's junior and attractive. Her favorite song was, 'You Belong to Me.' You know how they spent their honeymoon? They followed the lyrics of that song starting out in Egypt. My father was smart enough to have her sign a prenuptial agreement, but she hated me so much that she dedicated herself to persuading him to establish the foundation rather than leave his money to me. It would then be my role in life to administer it. She pointed out to my father that I would have a generous salary while I gave away his money, my money. She told him that in that way their names would be immortalized. He resisted for a while, but eventually gave in." "He's mad," Susan thought. "He's mad, and he's going to kill me, just the way he killed all the others." When the foundation was established 16 years ago, it was worth $100 million, he continued. Now it's worth $1 billion, and I can take the credit for most of its growth. But no matter how much money there is in the coffers, I still get only my paltry salary. His fingers were caressing her throat now. "I really think I could have been happy with you, Susan. If I'd married you, I might have tried to put the past behind me. But of course that wouldn't have worked, would it? The other night you sent Dee to take your place next to me at the table. You did it because you didn't want to be with me, didn't you?" "Alex," she said, "it's not going to do any good to kill me. There are hundreds more pictures being delivered to my office tomorrow. The police will study them one by one. I know I can't go on much longer, but I will finish my mission before I'm stopped. Remember the song? See the jungle when it's wet with rain? You know who was in the jungle today? Dee. She was on a tour in the rainforest in Costa Rica. That's close enough. Tomorrow people will be grieving for you when your body is discovered, but that won't happen until 9 o'clock or so. By then, Dee and I will be having breakfast in Panama. Her ship docks at night, and I will surprise her by joining her there. I have a turquoise ring for her. She'll read a great deal into it." The ringing of the telephone made him jump to his feet. They both listened intently as Don Richards left a message saying he was on his way to her office from LaGuardia, that he was worried about her. He was afraid that her investigation was putting her in danger. "He's right," Alex said calmly. "And now it's time." And with a sudden movement of his hand, he pulled the bag the rest of the way over her head and quickly sealed it. Then he pushed her under the desk. He stood up and looked down at his handiwork. "You'll die long before Richards gets here," he said. "It will take about 10 minutes. That's how long Regina lasted." The little air that had been trapped in the bag was almost gone. "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." The pain was starting to gather in her chest. "I don't want to die." She kicked her feet and managed to push her body out a few inches from under the desk. She felt the wastebasket against her right side. The wastebasket! The glass from the broken vase was in it! Gasping now, Susan heaved her body to the side, felt the basket topple over, heard the broken glass scatter on the floor. With one last effort, she moved her head from side to side. A sudden, terrible pain hit her as the jagged glass cut through the heavy plastic. Blood soaked her shoulder, but she could feel the plastic start to separate, feel the first faint hint of air. It was there on the floor of her office that Don Richards found her half an hour later. She was barely conscious, but she was alive. Alex Wright was waiting at the dock when the Valerie sailed into San Blas on Tuesday morning. It was 8 o'clock. He had left New York last night, going directly to the airport from Susan Chandler's office. He spotted Dee standing on the deck. She was smiling and waving at him. Or was she pointing to him? He was suddenly aware that men had moved up to stand on either side of him. Then he heard a low, deep voice saying, "You're under arrest, Mr. Wright. Please come with us quietly." Susan left Jane Clausen's room for the last time and got into the elevator. Unconsciously, she winced from the pain of the stitches in her shoulder and back. She wondered, was it really only 9 days ago that she'd first met Mrs. Clausen? Yes, the mystery of Regina Clausen's disappearance had been solved, but in the process, 3 other people had died, and a 4th was seriously injured. Susan comforted herself with the thought that Alex Wright had been stopped before he had a chance to murder Dee. And she had met Don Richards. He was a strange bird, she thought, a psychiatrist who denied himself the kind of help he offered on a daily basis, yet who finally summoned the strength to face his own demons and move on with his life. When Susan emerged from the elevator, Don Richards was waiting for her in the lobby. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Susan smiled at him, and he put his arms around her. It seemed to both of them that it was the natural thing to do.